You've arrived at Mr. Geronimo. Stay close, because things are about to get terrifying. The first thing you learn, if you spend enough time in the mountains of northern New Mexico in the fall, is how sound behaves. In town, sound bounces. It hits brick and glass and the metal skin of cars, and it comes back to you softened and layered. Up in the high country, in the ponderosa and the aspen, sound goes out in a straight line and does not come back. It disappears into the trees and into the sky, and what you hear is only what wants to be heard, exactly as it is. I have spent 17 Novembers up there, alone, in a cabin my uncle built in the 70s, on a low ridge above a bend of the Chama River. I know how a bull elk sounds a quarter of a mile off, and how the wind sounds when it comes down out of the San Juans, and how a person walking on frozen pine needles sounds different than a coyote walking on the same ground. I know these things the way you know the sound of your own front door. So when I tell you what I heard that November, I want you to understand that I am not the kind of man who mistakes one sound for another. I make my living working with my hands, not with my imagination, and I have never been the type to see faces in the trees. My name is Ray Cordell. I am 43 years old. I work at a hardware store in Farmington that my father-in-law owns, and I take 2 weeks of vacation every November to drive up into Carson National Forest and hunt mule deer by myself. This has been my routine since I was 26, which was the year my Uncle Wade signed the cabin over to me on a piece of yellow legal paper in a coffee shop in Chama. He built it himself in 1971 with a friend of his from the mill in Espanola, and by the time he handed it to me, he could not manage the drive. He passed the following spring, so the cabin is mine, and it has been mine ever since, and every November I go up there, and I go up alone. My brother Dean lives in Bakersfield, California. He has lived there for 11 years, working as a diesel mechanic for a produce company that ships almonds and pistachios. He used to come with me every year. When we were kids, our father took us up to the cabin as soon as we were old enough to sit still, and Dean shot his first mule deer buck at the age of 12 on a hillside about a mile east of the cabin, in a stand of aspens my uncle called the White Church. Dean and I hunted together every November from the year I was 26 until the year I was 37. Then he took the job in Bakersfield, and his wife had twins the following year, and his hunting days got squeezed down to a long weekend in the Sierras, and he stopped coming out to New Mexico. He and I still talk on the phone about twice a month. He is my only sibling. Our parents are both gone now, and there is not much left of our family except him and me and the cabin and a few old photographs in a coffee can on the mantel. I say all this so you understand that I know my brother's voice. I have known it my whole life. I know the way he laughs, and I know the little catch he gets in his throat when he is tired, and I know the way he calls my name. He has called my name 1,000 times. He called it when we were boys, when he wanted me to come look at something he had found in the yard. He called it in the woods, when we were sitting a stand 50 yards apart and he had a deer moving. He called it at our mother's funeral, standing in the parking lot behind the church, when I had walked off to be alone and he came to bring me back inside. I know the sound of my brother calling my name, the way I know my own hands. That is important because in November of last year I heard him call it, out in the trees behind the cabin, 3 separate times. And Dean was in Bakersfield, California, 940 miles away, the whole time. I want to tell you what happened up there, the way it happened, in the order it happened, and I will try not to embellish and I will try not to leave anything out. I am not looking for anything from you. I am not writing a book. I do not want money, and I do not want attention. I am telling this because a friend of mine who works for the Sheriff's Department in Rio Arriba County told me I ought to write it down so that if anything ever happens to me, or if anything ever happens to another hunter up in that country, someone will have it on paper. That is the only reason. Take it or leave it. I do not care one way or the other, and I do not have anything to prove. I drove up on the 2nd of November. I remember the date because it was the day after my daughter's birthday, and my wife made me stay 1 extra day at home so I could be at the party, and I left the following morning at 4 in the morning with a thermos of black coffee and a paper bag of green chili burritos my wife had made the night before. My truck is a 2004 Toyota Tacoma with a shell over the bed, and by that point in her life she had close to 240,000 miles on her, and she still ran like a Swiss watch. I have owned 4 trucks in my life, and she is the best of them. The drive from Farmington up to the cabin takes about 4 hours if the weather is clean. You come north on 550 to Bloomfield, then east on 64 through the Jicarilla country, and down through Dulce and on into Chama. From Chama, it is another 40 minutes on paved road, and then 25 minutes on a Forest Service road that is graded gravel for the first 8 miles and turns into rutted dirt after that, and then a mile of two-track through the pines that only somebody who knew where he was going could find in the winter. My uncle put a rusted metal drum with a red painted top at the turnoff back in 1978, and that drum is still there, and it is still the only way to know where the road bends off. The weather that morning was cold and clear. The sky over Farmington was still black when I pulled out of my driveway, and by the time I crossed the Colorado line and turned east, the sun was just coming up over the Jicarilla mesas, and the whole world looked like it had been washed. There was frost on the sage and on the wire fences along the road, and I saw 2 coyotes running across an open field near Lindrith, and a red-tailed hawk sitting on top of a telephone pole with his chest all puffed up against the cold. I remember all of this in detail because it was such a nice morning, the kind of morning you drive into, and it makes you feel like the whole year has been worth it. I stopped in Chama for gas at the Chevron on the north end of town, and I bought a cup of coffee and a bag of pistachios from a lady named Elena who has worked that counter for as long as I have been coming up. She always asks me how many bucks I got the year before, and I always tell her, and she always nods and asks me if I want any of that green chili pistachio brittle her cousin makes, and I always say yes. That was our routine. I bought the brittle, and I filled the truck, and I asked her how her boy was doing, because he had gone off to trade school in Albuquerque the year before, and she told me he was doing fine. Then I got back in the truck and drove north out of Chama and turned east onto the forest road at about 10:15 in the morning. The road into my uncle's cabin climbs about 1,500 feet from the highway. You come up out of the sage country and into pinyon and juniper, and then into ponderosa, and then, if you go far enough, into the big spruce and fir. The cabin sits at about 9,200 feet, right on the edge of where the ponderosa gives way to the spruce. There is a small stand of aspen on the north side of the cabin, and on the south side there is a meadow of about 6 acres that slopes down to a little stream that runs into the Chama farther on. Beyond the meadow the country gets steep, and there is a long ridge covered in dog-hair thick timber that runs east to west, and I have shot most of my deer over the last 17 years along the edges of that ridge or in the low country on the far side of it. I got to the cabin a little after 11 that morning. The road up was in good shape. There had been no snow yet, which is unusual for early November in that country, but not unheard of. The forecast was calling for a system to come through on the 7th, with a chance of 6 to 10 inches. That was in my plans. I like the snow because it makes tracking easier, and because it seems to move the deer down out of the high stuff. I planned to hunt the first 4 days without snow, out of the meadow and along the low edges of the ridge, and then when the storm came in, I would move up into the timber and hunt closer to the cabin. That was the plan. The cabin itself is about 600 square feet. It has 2 rooms. There is a main room with a wood stove, a small kitchen counter with a hand pump for water, and a 2-burner propane cooktop, and a wooden table where you can sit and eat and clean your rifle. Off the back there is a small bedroom with 2 single beds and a chest of drawers. There is no electricity, there is no cell service, there is a battery-powered radio, and there is a 2-way base station VHF radio that my uncle set up in the 70s that talks to a repeater on Chama Peak. It is fussy and only works when the weather is clear, but it is there. There is a propane refrigerator. There is a chemical toilet in a lean-to about 10 yards behind the cabin. There is a woodshed on the north wall stacked with about 1.5 cords of ponderosa and dead spruce. My uncle used to say the cabin had everything a man needed and nothing a man did not need, and I have never known him to be wrong about that. I pulled the truck up under the aspen where I always park, and I unloaded my gear, and I checked the cabin for mice, of which there were the usual few, and I made a mental note to reset the traps under the counter. I brought in my rifle case, which held my Remington 700 and 30-06 with a Leupold VX2 3x9 on top of it, and I set it on the table and I got a fire going in the wood stove. It always takes a while to warm up because the walls are old and the chinking is not as good as it once was. But if you keep the stove going through the night, the main room stays comfortable, and if you shut the bedroom door and pile enough blankets on the bed, you can sleep without a hat on. I spent the rest of that first day getting the cabin the way I wanted it. I filled the water jugs from the spring about 100 yards behind the cabin. The spring runs out of a rock face and into a shallow rock pool my uncle lined with concrete in 1974. It has never once gone dry in 17 years, even in the drought years. I checked the propane tanks and swapped in the fresh one I had brought up in the truck. I set the mouse traps. I brought in enough wood to last 3 days. I laid my hunting clothes out on the second bed in the back room, because the second bed serves as a gear bench when I am up there alone, and I checked my rifle. Then, in the last hour of daylight, I walked out with 2 of my trail cameras and set them up in places I had used for years. The trail cameras are important, so I will describe them. I have 5 of them. They are Stealth Cam brand medium-tier models. Nothing fancy. They run on 8 AA batteries and take a 32 gigabyte SD card. They shoot color pictures in the day and infrared black and white at night. When something warm walks in front of them, they trigger and they take a picture. And after about 2 seconds, they take another one. Then they wait about 30 seconds and reset. They are strapped to trees with adjustable nylon straps and small aluminum brackets. I have used the same 5 cameras for 4 seasons, and they have never given me any trouble beyond the occasional water in the housing after a hard rain. I put out 2 of them that first afternoon. One I set on a saddle between the meadow and the beginning of the ridge, where I have shot 2 deer in the past 4 years. The other I put out on the north end of the meadow, near the stream, on a rub line I had found the year before. I set them at deer height, about waist high on me, angled slightly downward. I brushed the leaves away from the sensors, and I turned them on, and I walked away without any funny business. I have done this exact thing 100 times. By the time I got back to the cabin, the sun was going down behind the ridge west of the meadow, and the air had that thin, cold smell that high country air gets in November when the days are still bright and the nights are already cold enough to freeze the water in your boots if you leave them outside. I made a pan of green chili and eggs from the burritos and put a pot of pinto beans on the wood stove to warm up for the morning. I sat at the table with my rifle in my lap and I cleaned it out of habit, though it did not need to be cleaned. I drank a beer, one of 2 I had brought. I read a paperback western my wife had picked up for me at a garage sale. I went to bed at about 9. That was the first day. Nothing about it was unusual. It was, I want to say, one of the finest first days I have ever had at the cabin. I want to be clear about that. Because when I try to think of when things started, when the thing that happened started, my mind keeps trying to reach back into that first day and find something that was already wrong. But there was nothing. It was a good, quiet, ordinary first day, and I fell asleep with a full stomach and a warm stove, thinking about where I would sit the following morning. I woke up at 4:30, which is my usual time in the cabin. I dressed in the murk of the front room by the orange light of the stove door, which I had propped open a crack to check the coals. I ate a bowl of pinto beans standing up. I made a thermos of coffee. I put on my orange vest and my hunter orange stocking cap, and I picked up my rifle, and I walked out into the yard. The sky was full of stars. There was no wind at all. The temperature was probably around 22-23 degrees. I walked down to the meadow in the murk, using a small red headlamp because red does not spook the deer as much as white does. I sat that morning on a stand my uncle built into a big ponderosa on the edge of the meadow. It is a simple wooden platform about 12 feet up, with a plywood floor and a 2x6 seat and a little rail my uncle put in for a rifle rest. It is comfortable. It is where I have taken most of the deer I have ever taken in that country. I climbed up in the murk, and I sat, and I waited for the world to come alive. There was a nice frost. The stars faded, and the eastern sky went from gray to pale blue, and the meadow came up out of the shadow in patches. First the tallest tips of the grass, then the sage clumps, then the whole floor of it. I saw a red fox trot across the far end at about 6:15. I saw 2 cow elk come out of the timber on the north side at about 6:30, walk halfway across the meadow, and turn back. I saw a coyote at 7. I did not see a deer. That is a normal morning up there. The deer in that country are not thick. You are hunting them, not shooting them, and you might sit 3 days without seeing a shootable buck, and then on the 4th day you see 2 or 3. I climbed down at about 10:30 and walked back to the cabin, and I made myself a sandwich, and I took a nap on top of the covers in the back room for about 2 hours. Then I went out again for the evening hunt at a different stand up in the aspen behind the cabin, and I saw nothing but a red squirrel and a Steller's jay. I got back to the cabin at dusk, and I made supper, and I went to bed. That was day 2. Day 3 was similar. I sat the meadow in the morning and saw one small forked buck at about 300 yards that stepped out of the timber, sniffed the air, and stepped right back in. I did not shoot at him because I was not sure of his rack and because there was still plenty of season left, and because at that distance I would have been guessing. I hunted the aspen behind the cabin in the evening and saw a lone doe come through and go by me at 70 yards. On the morning of day 4, I decided to check the trail cameras before I did anything else, because I had 2 more cameras I wanted to put out farther east along the ridge, and I wanted to see what had been moving. I pulled the cards out of both cameras and swapped in fresh ones, and I put the used cards in a little canvas pouch, and I hiked back to the cabin. I sat down at the table and I opened the laptop I had brought up in the truck. I do not usually bring the laptop, but the winter before I had bought it used from a coworker for $150, and I had figured I would use it up at the cabin to review the trail cam pictures more easily than I could on the little viewer that comes with the cameras. I put the first card in and scrolled through it. The first camera, the one on the saddle, had triggered 47 times over 3 days. Most of the pictures were of the same small forked buck I had seen on day 3. There were 3 pictures of a doe with 2 fawns. There were 7 pictures of the same big coyote from 3 different nights. There was a picture of a black bear from just after midnight on the second night, which was a treat because I had not seen a bear on any of my cards for 2 seasons. Everything ordinary. I put the second card in. This was the camera on the north end of the meadow, near the rub line. I want to describe this next part carefully. The camera on the north end of the meadow had triggered 63 times over 3 days. Most of the pictures were of elk. A cow elk and a spike bull moved through the meadow at least 4 times, coming down out of the timber to feed in the pre-dawn and then going back up. There was a red fox on the second night. There were 2 pictures of a great horned owl, or something that looked like one, sitting on the edge of the frame on a low branch. Ordinary things. But at 2:47 in the morning on the second night, the camera had triggered, and the picture was blank. That is not unusual. Sometimes a warm air current will trigger a trail camera, and you will get a picture of nothing but empty meadow. What was unusual was that the timestamp on the very next picture, which the camera should have taken about 2 seconds after the first, was 2:47 also, and it was also blank. And the next picture, 30 seconds later, was blank as well. Then, at 2:49, the camera triggered again, and this picture was not blank. The picture was of the meadow, in the infrared black and white, and about 20 yards out from the camera, right in the middle of the frame, there was an animal. It was standing broadside to the camera. It looked at first like a mule deer doe. Long body, 4 legs, ears up, not so unusual. But something was wrong with it, and I could not immediately say what. I zoomed in on the picture on my laptop. The screen was small, and the picture was black and white and had that grainy quality that infrared trail cam pictures have, so I could not see everything I would have wanted to see. But there were 3 things I noticed after looking at the picture for about a minute. The first thing was that the animal's legs were the wrong length. The front legs looked like a deer's, or close to it. The back legs looked longer than they should have been, and they were bent at what looked like the wrong angle, as if it had extra joints. I could have been wrong. It could have been the way it was standing, or the shadow. The second thing was that its head was not pointed the way a deer's head is pointed when a deer stands broadside. A deer, standing broadside, will either have its head down grazing, or it will have its head up looking at something. This animal's head was turned all the way toward the camera. Not the way a deer looks over at something, all the way. Its whole face was pointed straight at the camera lens. The angle of its neck was wrong. The third thing was the eyes. The camera flash from an infrared trail cam usually catches an animal's eye shine as 2 bright dots. Deer eyes reflect white or greenish white, coyote eyes reflect green, bear eyes reflect red. The eyes in this picture were not reflecting, they were flat. They were dull, like 2 dabs of pencil lid. As if they were not eyes at all, or as if the animal had closed them, or as if they were looking through the camera in a way that eyes do not usually look through anything. I sat and I stared at this picture for a long time. I told myself it was a doe. I told myself the leg thing was a shadow, and the neck thing was some artifact of the compression, and the eyes were shut for some reason, maybe because a night bug had flown past. I told myself these things, and I mostly believed them. What is more likely than a doe? Every reasonable answer is a doe. If you eliminate the reasonable answers, you are left with the unreasonable ones, and I do not like unreasonable answers. I am a plain man. I like plain explanations. I looked at the next picture. The next picture was 2 seconds later. In the next picture, the meadow was empty. The animal was gone. From the position it was in, moving out of frame at a running gait, it would have needed to be going about 40 miles an hour to be out of frame in 2 seconds. A mule deer at a full run is capable of that speed for short bursts, so that is not impossible, but it is not usual either. The camera did not trigger again for the rest of the night. I looked at the pictures for another few minutes, and then I closed the laptop, and I made myself a second cup of coffee, and I went outside, and I stood in the yard, and I looked out at the meadow, which was pretty and quiet in the mid-morning sun. I told myself I would go back out to that camera, and I would look at the ground, and I would find deer tracks, and that would be the end of it. I want to be honest with you. The picture bothered me. I do not want to pretend that it did not. It bothered me the way something bothers you when you cannot say why, but it did not scare me. Not yet. Not on the morning of day 4. I was still a man alone at his cabin in the woods, doing what he had always done, thinking about deer. I put the laptop away, and I ate a bowl of pinto beans, and I put my rifle on my shoulder, and I walked back down to the meadow to look at the ground under the rub line. It was the middle of a bright morning. The sun was warm. There was no wind. Nothing in the world seemed out of place. I did not find deer tracks under the rub line. I did not find any tracks under the rub line at all. The ground under the camera, in the soft place where the frost had melted and the mud was fresh, was smooth and undisturbed. I stood over it for a long time. I looked 5 yards in every direction. I found the tracks of the elk that had come through earlier in the night, and I found the fox tracks, and I found my own tracks from the day before. I did not find any tracks of a doe, or of anything shaped like a doe, from the direction the animal in the picture had been walking, and I did not find any tracks going out in the direction the animal in the picture would have gone in the next frame. The meadow was dead quiet. I stood there for a good 10 minutes. Then I told myself that the frost had been heavy that morning, and that maybe the tracks had been in the hard pack under the frost, and I had walked over them, and I told myself a few other things that were less than fully convincing. I took the used SD card out of my pocket and looked at it. I put it back in my pocket. I walked back to the cabin. I want to say something about that walk back. It was a walk I had taken hundreds of times, in the middle of the morning, in bright sun, through country I knew as well as I knew my own yard. But that walk back, on the morning of day 4, was the first time in 17 years I ever felt, on that walk, like I wanted to look over my shoulder. I did not look over my shoulder. I told myself there was nothing to look at. I kept walking, and I got back to the cabin, and I ate lunch, and I told myself the rest of the day would be normal. And it was. The rest of the day, and the next day, and the day after that. If I had left the cabin on the 6th of November, I would have gone home with an empty freezer and a strange picture on an SD card, and a story I would have told 2 or 3 friends over beers at Christmas, and I would have laughed about it. I did not leave on the 6th. The storm came in on the 7th, right on the forecast, and it dropped 7 inches of dry powder overnight, and the next morning was the first morning I heard my brother's voice out behind the cabin. And after that morning, nothing at that cabin was ordinary anymore. The storm came in the way the forecast said it would. I had spent the 6th of November sitting a fresh spot up in the timber above the meadow, where I had put out my 3rd trail camera the day before, and I had seen a big 4x4 buck at about 180 yards moving through a stringer of aspens on the far side of a shallow draw. I had put the crosshair on him. I had felt the bump my heart makes when I know I am about to take a shot I have been waiting 7 days for. And then he had stepped behind a downed spruce, and he had not come out the other side. And by the time I had climbed down and worked my way over to where he had been, an hour later, he was gone. I had followed his tracks up into the black timber for about a quarter mile before I lost them on a rocky bench. I had walked back to the cabin in a foul mood, and I had eaten supper without much appetite, and I had gone to bed early. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of snow. If you have not spent a night in a cabin in a heavy snowstorm, I want to describe the sound to you. It is not silence. Snow, when it is coming down fast enough, has a hush to it, like the sound of a soft brush on a drumhead. It comes through the walls, and it settles around you, and it fills the little spaces inside the cabin. It is one of the finest sounds I know, and it always has been. I lay in the back room for a while, and I listened to it, and I thought about the 4x4 buck, and I thought about the storm covering my scent, and the tracks in the meadow, and I thought about the morning coming. Then I got up and I stoked the stove and I went back to sleep. I woke again at about 4 in the morning. and I could tell by the muffled sound outside that the snow had piled up. I got dressed and I opened the front door. The yard was blue and lightless under the clouds. There was probably 7 inches on the ground, on top of the ground that had been bare the night before, and it was still coming down at a slow, steady rate, big flakes, no wind at all. It was a beautiful sight, and I stood in the doorway for a minute with a mug of coffee in my hand. That is when I first heard something that did not belong. It was a small sound. It was so small I almost did not hear it. Somewhere behind the cabin, up in the aspen, there was a soft, brief tapping. 3 light taps, evenly spaced on wood, like a man knocking politely on a door. I stood there and I listened. I could not tell how far off it had been. Snow does strange things to sound. It could have been 50 yards, or 100, or 200. It could have been the crack of a branch under the weight of new snow, warmed by contact and popping. It could have been a downy woodpecker starting the day, which they will sometimes do even before first light. It could have been 100 things. I listened for about a minute. I did not hear it again. I went back inside and I finished my coffee and I put on my gear. I decided I would not sit the stand in the meadow that morning because there was no wind and my scent would pool in the cold air along the creek and everything down there would be able to smell me for a mile. Instead, I would still hunt up along the ridge on the east side, where there is a series of small benches that hold deer during the day. I would work my way up slowly. The fresh snow would let me see everything. I left the cabin at about 5:30. It was still snowing, but a little lighter now, and the eastern sky was starting to gray up. I had my headlamp on red, and I could see maybe 50 feet ahead of me. I crossed the yard, and I went past the woodshed, and I started up the little trail my uncle had cleared out to the outhouse, and beyond that up into the aspen. At the edge of the aspen, I stopped, because I could see something in the snow at the base of a tree about 20 feet in. I want to describe what I saw carefully. There was a mark in the snow, at the base of a big aspen with a fork in the trunk. The mark was about the size of a dinner plate. It was pressed down into the snow, deeper on one edge than on the other, as if something had leaned against the tree there and shifted its weight. It was not a track of a hoof or a paw or a boot. It was a shape without a shape, if that makes sense. Around it, in a rough half-circle, were 4 smaller indentations, deeper than the big one, spread out the way the fingers on a hand might spread out if you leaned your hand against a tree and then took it away. I stood there in the snow with my red headlamp on, and I looked at this mark for what must have been 3 or 4 minutes. There were no other tracks around it. The snow all around the base of the tree was clean, and my own tracks came up to the edge of the aspen and stopped, and the marks on the tree were the only disturbance in that whole part of the woods. Now, I am not going to tell you I knew what the marks were. I did not know what they were. I still do not know. What I told myself at the time, standing there in the snow with the red headlamp on, was that something had fallen out of the tree. A clump of snow off a branch, maybe, or a big piece of bark, or a broken limb. That kind of thing happens all the time in a fresh snowfall. Weight builds up on a branch, the branch drops it, the mass hits the ground, and you get a strange-looking mark. That is the most likely explanation. That was what I told myself. The problem was that the 4 smaller indentations around the plate-sized mark were arranged too neatly. They were not scattered, the way debris from a branch would have been. They were spaced, 4 of them, spaced roughly evenly, in an arc, on the uphill side of the plate-sized mark. I turned and I looked up into the tree. There were no broken branches over the spot. There were no clumps of snow missing from the boughs. I looked back down at the marks. I bent down and I put my own hand against the tree above the plate-sized mark, palm flat, fingers spread. My hand fit inside the plate-sized mark with room to spare in every direction. I stood up. I told myself I had wasted enough time on this. I told myself the light was coming. I would work up the ridge, and I would see deer, and when I came back down in the afternoon I would look at the marks again in real daylight, and I would laugh at myself. I hunted the ridge that morning. I saw 2 does and a spikebuck. I did not shoot at any of them. I saw the tracks of an elk herd that had crossed the ridge in the night. I saw the tracks of a bobcat. I saw the tracks of a snowshoe hare. Everything was ordinary. I felt better as the morning went on. By the time I came off the ridge at about 11 and started back down toward the cabin, I had almost forgotten the marks on the tree. Almost. I came down through the aspen from a slightly different direction, and I passed the tree with the fork in the trunk without meaning to, and I stopped, and I looked at it. The marks were gone. The snow around the base of the tree was smooth, It had been snowing lightly all morning, but not hard enough to fill in a mark of that depth. My own boot tracks from the morning were still visible on the trail, indented but present. The marks on the tree, though, had not been filled in. They had been erased, or rather the snow around the base of the tree looked as if it had been pushed around, gently, so that no clean tracks remained. There were no fresh tracks around the tree, no boot tracks, no hoof tracks, no paw tracks. I stood there for a while. Then I walked back to the cabin. I ate lunch, and I did not go out again that afternoon. I told my wife in my head that I had a headache and needed to lie down, which is a thing I do sometimes when I am trying to work something out, hold a conversation with her in my head as if she were there. I lay down on top of the covers in the back room, and I looked at the ceiling, and I thought about the picture on the trail camera, and I thought about the marks on the tree. I told myself that a bear had been at the tree. Bears will sometimes lean up against a tree to scratch. A bear leaning against a tree with its shoulder and one paw would leave marks similar to what I had seen. A bear coming back through in the morning would leave tracks over its own marks, and if the wind had been just right, the tracks might have drifted in without me noticing. I told myself this was a very plausible explanation. I told myself it was the correct explanation. Then I told myself that the picture on the trail camera had been a deer, and the missing tracks under the rub line had been a matter of the frost being harder in that spot, and I put both things away in the back of my mind, and I dozed off. I slept for about 2 hours. When I woke up, the sun was going down, and the clouds had broken up into thin, flat gray bands to the west, and the last of the daylight was coming across the meadow in long yellow strips. I sat up on the edge of the bed, and I felt good. I felt rested. I felt like I had shaken off whatever mood I had been in that morning. I put on the coffee pot, and I got the stove built back up. I decided I would go out to my third trail camera in the last hour of light and pull the card and see what had been on it since the day before. It was only a 15-minute walk. I could be back before it was fully lightless. I picked up my rifle, and I put on my orange vest, and I stepped out of the cabin, and I started up the trail toward the aspen. I want to explain this next part very carefully. I had walked about halfway across the yard, maybe 30 feet from the cabin door, when I heard my name. It came from behind me and off to the right, from the direction of the meadow, or the edge of the meadow, or the timber on the north side of the meadow. I cannot say exactly where, because sound in that country carries strangely, especially when there is fresh snow. It was not close. It was probably about 150 yards off. It was clear enough that I heard it distinctly. It was clear enough that I stopped in my tracks. The voice said, "Ray." That was the whole word, one syllable, called out the way you would call across a yard to a neighbor, not shouted, not panicked, just my name, said out loud, at a normal calling volume, from the timber below the cabin. And it was my brother Dean's voice. I want to be very careful here. I did not mishear. I did not confuse it with a jay or an elk or the wind. I did not stand there and think, that sounds like it could be Dean. I turned my head at the sound of it, and I said, out loud before I had time to think, Dean, as if he had been in the room with me, as if I had heard him call from the next room in my own house. It was that clear. It was that unmistakably his voice. I stood in the yard with my rifle in one hand and the strap of the camera pouch in the other, and I stared at the timber. The last of the yellow light was on the tops of the trees. Nothing moved. I did not hear anything else. I stood there and I waited. I want you to understand this. I did not immediately think, that is impossible, because Dean is in Bakersfield. I did not immediately think anything sensible at all. What I thought, in the first 2 or 3 seconds, was that Dean had driven out to surprise me. That my brother, whom I had not seen for 18 months, had gotten in his truck and driven all night and turned up at the cabin. It was the first thing my mind reached for. It was the only thing that made sense to it, in those first seconds. I called back. "Dean," I said, "is that you?" Nothing answered. The timber did not move. The last of the sun slid off the top of the ridge, and the light in the yard turned that cold gray-blue color it turns when the sun goes down in the snow country. I called again. "Dean, where are you?" Nothing. I stood there for another minute, and I felt the cold coming up through the soles of my boots, and I started to feel the first thing that was not just puzzlement. It was not fear, yet. It was the small, clean feeling of knowing that something was wrong. Not a wrong you can name. A wrong that has not settled into a shape yet. Just wrong. I looked down at my rifle. I clicked the safety off, and I checked the chamber, and I put a round in, and I clicked the safety back on. Then I walked, slowly, back to the cabin, and I went inside, and I shut the door, and I stood in the front room with my rifle in my hands. I put my rifle on the table, and I went over to the base station VHF radio. I turned it on. The little dial glowed green. I keyed the mic. K5 base to Chama repeater. Radio check, over. There was a moment of static, and then a familiar voice came back. It was a man named Curtis who runs a fishing outfit up out of Chama and monitors the repeater as a hobby. Curtis has been on that repeater for as long as I have been coming to the cabin. K5 base, this is Curtis. You are readable, over. I keyed back. Curtis, this is Ray Cordell up at the Wade cabin. Do me a favor and call my brother Dean at this number, and just ask him to text me on the radio through you when he can, just to check in, over. I read him Dean's cell number. Curtis said he would call. He asked if I was all right. I said I was fine, that I had gotten a strange feeling and I just wanted to hear my brother's voice was all. Curtis said he understood. He was a nice man, and he did not ask any more. I sat at the table in the cabin with the stove ticking behind me and the last light going out of the sky in the window over the sink, and I waited. Curtis came back on the radio about 12 minutes later. Ray, this is Curtis, over. Curtis, go ahead, over. I talked to Dean. He is home. He is fine. He was on the couch watching a football game. He said to tell you he is fine and to ask if everything is all right up there. Over. I keyed back. Tell him everything is fine. I just had a moment. I am sorry to have bothered you both. Over. Curtis said it was no bother, and that if I needed anything else I should just call. I thanked him. I switched off the radio. Then I sat at the table for a long time. 940 miles. Dean was 940 miles away, in Bakersfield, sitting on his couch watching a football game. And I had heard him call my name, in his voice, from the timber below my uncle's cabin, not 15 minutes before. I want to walk you through the way I tried to make sense of it that night, because I think it is important that you see how a plain man tries to reason through something like this. The first explanation I tried was that I had misheard, that the sound had been an elk, or a bird, or a piece of the wind in the trees, and that my mind had shaped it into my brother's voice because my brother was on my mind. That is a real thing that minds do. Anyone who has spent enough time alone in the woods has done it at least once. I have done it before, in fact. 2 years ago, up in that same country, I had thought I heard someone whistle at me from a ridge, and it had turned out to be a mountain chickadee. But this had not been a whistle, it had been a word, called clearly, and it had been my name. The second explanation I tried was that another hunter was up in that country and had shouted a name that sounded like mine. There is another cabin about 4 miles west of mine, owned by a family from Espanola, and I had seen tire tracks on the forest road on my way in that indicated somebody might be up at that cabin as well. It was not impossible that a hunter from that cabin had wandered onto the ridge below mine and had called out to a partner named something similar to Ray, maybe Ray himself, and that I had heard it and thought it was for me. But it had not been called out. It had been said, at a normal calling volume from 150 yards away, and no hunter I have ever met would call his partner Ray, and Ray only, no last name, no follow-up shout, no over here or where are you, and then stand silent when the partner did not answer. Hunters do not do that. Nobody does that. The third explanation I tried was that I had imagined the whole thing, that I had been tired and rattled by the marks on the tree, and I had heard a bit of the wind and my mind had assembled it into a voice. This was possible. I could not rule it out. I have to be honest with you and tell you that I could not rule it out. But I could not make myself believe it either. I know what I heard. I heard my brother's voice, from out in the timber, call my name. The fourth explanation was that somebody, some person up there in the woods, had heard me talking to Curtis on the radio, or overheard me talking to myself on the trail earlier in the day, and had learned my name, and had called out to me as a prank or as a way to draw me out. That was the explanation I could not put down, because it was the only one that had a shape. But it had two problems. The first problem was that the voice had not been a stranger's imitation of my brother. It had been my brother's voice. Exactly, not close, exactly. And no stranger in the timber below my uncle's cabin had any way to have heard my brother's voice, let alone imitate it perfectly. The second problem was that the closest cabin to mine was 4 miles off, and there had been no tracks in the fresh snow between here and there, at least not that I had seen while hunting the ridge that morning. So I sat at the table and I could not talk myself into any of the explanations, and I could not talk myself out of any of them either. What I ended up with, at the end of about 2 hours of thinking, was a decision to sleep on it. I decided I would not go out to that trail camera that night. I decided I would go to bed with the doors locked, which is not a thing I normally do at the cabin, and I would get up in the morning, and I would decide then whether to stay up or to pack it in and go home. I ate a can of chili on the wood stove. I did not have much appetite. I read my paperback for a little while, but I could not concentrate on it. I went to bed at about 9, with my rifle propped in the corner of the back room, loaded, safety on, chamber occupied. I fell asleep with the wood stove ticking in the front room and the snow falling again outside. I slept badly. I woke up twice, once at about 11 and once at about 2, and both times I lay in the bed for a while and listened, and both times I heard nothing but the stove and the occasional soft sound of snow sliding off the roof. Both times I told myself I was being foolish, and both times I went back to sleep. The third time I woke up, it was 3:37 in the morning. I know it was 3:37 because I looked at my wristwatch, and I knew, before I looked at the watch, before I was fully awake, that something outside the cabin had made a sound. I lay in the bed and I did not move. I listened. For about a minute there was nothing. Then, from somewhere out on the trail between the cabin and the outhouse, I heard the sound of a boot in fresh snow. It was a single step, just one, slow and deliberate, the crunch of snow being compressed under weight, and then the crunch of the snow settling back. A pause, then another step, then another. Someone was walking, slowly, up the path from the outhouse toward the back of the cabin. I want to describe the walking to you as precisely as I can, because it is important. The steps were slow. There was maybe 2 full seconds between one step and the next. They were also heavy, heavier than my own steps would have been. The compression of the snow was deep. Whoever was walking was a big person, or was carrying something, and the steps were even. There was no shuffle. There was no dragging. There was no rustle of clothing. Just the clean, slow, even, heavy sound of a boot in snow. I lay in the bed and I did not breathe. My rifle was 3 steps away in the corner. My hand was under the blanket, curled into a fist. I could see the outline of the window over the head of the bed, faint gray in the lightless room, and I could see the outline of the door to the front room, cracked open 2 inches the way I always leave it so the heat from the stove can come back into the bedroom. The steps came up along the back wall of the cabin, slow, even. I could tell, from the sound, that whoever was walking was on the north side, right up against the wall, right along the little strip of dirt where the cabin's eaves protect the ground from the deepest snow. The steps went past the corner of the cabin, past the woodshed, along the north wall, and stopped, exactly, at a spot I could hear was directly beneath the window at the head of the bed. Directly beneath the window that was about 18 inches above my face as I lay there. I did not move. There was a long silence, maybe 20 seconds, maybe a full minute. It felt like a lot longer. Then, from the other side of the wall, from just below the window, a voice said, very quietly and very clearly, "Ray." It was my brother's voice. It was my brother's voice, close now, not from the timber, not from 150 yards, from 18 inches, from the other side of a wall I could reach out and touch. It said, "Ray, come outside." I did not move. I did not breathe. I did not answer. There was another long silence, and then the voice said, once, softly, "Please." And then the steps started again, slow and even and heavy, and they went back the way they had come, along the north wall, past the woodshed, around the corner, back down the path toward the outhouse. And after about 20 seconds I could not hear them anymore. I lay in the bed for another hour. I did not move. My whole body had gone cold and rigid, and it took a long time for it to loosen. I did not get up to look out any of the windows. I did not go for the rifle. I did not turn on any light. I lay there in the murk, and I stared at the ceiling, and I listened for the sound of any other step, and none came. At about 4:30 in the morning, I got up. I went into the front room. I picked up the rifle. I sat at the table in the murk, and I put the rifle across my knees, and I waited for the sun to come up. I want to tell you what I did on the morning of the 8th of November, because I did not do the thing I probably should have done, which was to get in the truck and leave. I did not leave, not right away. Instead, I sat at the table until the first blue of dawn showed at the windows, and then I got up, and I made coffee, and I opened the front door slowly, and I stepped out into the yard, and I walked around the cabin with my rifle up and the safety off. The snow around the cabin was clean. I want to describe this. The snow that had fallen in the night was maybe an inch or an inch and a half of fresh powder on top of what had been there before. It was clean and soft and undisturbed, all the way around the cabin, around the back where the steps had come, under the window at the head of the bed, along the north wall, past the woodshed, on the path to the outhouse, all the way to the outhouse, all the way from the outhouse back to the tree line. Clean, undisturbed, not a single track, not a single mark of any kind, no boot, no paw, no hoof, not even the round pockmark of a big lump of snow that had fallen off the roof. Nothing. I want to be clear that this was not a case of the tracks being covered over by the fresh snow. There had been maybe an inch of new snow. The steps I had heard had been deep and heavy in the deeper snow underneath. If a man had walked through that snow in the night, his tracks would have been sunk down into the older layer and only lightly dusted with the new, and I would have seen them clearly. There were no tracks. It was as if nothing had come near the cabin at all. I stood in the yard for a long time. I looked back at the cabin. I looked at the window at the head of the bed. I looked at the snow beneath it, and the snow along the wall, and the snow around the woodshed, and I could not make what I was seeing agree with what I had heard. Then I went to my trail camera on the aspen tree behind the cabin, the third one I had set out, the one I had not gone to check the evening before. I unclipped the SD card, and I brought it back to the cabin, and I put it in the laptop, and I turned the laptop on. The camera had triggered 18 times during the night. The first 15 triggers were ordinary. A fox came through at about 8 in the evening. A red squirrel triggered it 3 times just before that. There were 2 elk pictures from earlier in the evening. There were 4 false triggers of empty background, which is normal in a snowstorm because the flakes will sometimes trip the sensor. The last 3 triggers were at 3:33, 3:34, and 3:35 in the morning, 2 minutes before I woke up, 2 minutes before I heard the first step. I want to describe the pictures to you. The first picture, at 3:33, was of the aspen trees around the camera, in the infrared black and white, empty. But down at the very bottom of the frame, in one corner, there was a shape, just a piece of a shape, a curve, like the top of a shoulder or the top of a head, moving through the frame at ground level, low. It was moving out of the frame in the direction of the cabin. The second picture, 30 seconds later, was empty. The aspen trees, no shape. The third picture, 30 seconds after that, was also empty. Aspen trees, nothing, except that in the second and third pictures, the snow at the base of the tree that the camera was strapped to, the snow directly in the foreground of the picture, had a shape in it. 2 long parallel indentations, spaced about the width of a man's shoulders apart, running out of the bottom of the frame. Not footprints, not paw prints, long parallel indentations, as if someone had been lying flat on his belly in the snow, at the base of the tree, directly under the camera. I sat and I looked at these 3 pictures for a long time. I zoomed in on them. I looked at each of them at every level of enlargement my laptop could show. The picture quality was not good, but the shapes were what they were. I got up from the table, and I went back outside, and I walked to the aspen tree, and I looked at the snow at the base of it. The snow was clean, fresh powder on top. I brushed it aside with my glove. Underneath, the older, harder layer showed the indentations. 2 long, roughly parallel channels in the snow, running for about 6 feet, starting at the base of the aspen and heading in the direction of the cabin. They were about 18 inches apart. There were no tracks around them, no boot prints, no handprints, nothing. I stood in the snow next to the aspen, and I looked at the parallel channels for about a minute. Then I walked, slowly, in the direction they pointed. I walked with my rifle in front of me and my thumb on the safety. The channels ran for 6 feet and then stopped. Just stopped. In the middle of the aspen grove, 20 feet from the tree, they ended, and there was clean snow beyond them, and there was clean snow to either side of them, and there was clean snow all the way from where they ended to the back wall of the cabin, which was, I noticed, exactly the length of a walk that begins with a slow, heavy step and ends beneath a window 18 inches above a man's face. I walked back to the cabin. I went inside. I locked the door. I sat at the table, and I made myself a plan. I decided I was going to leave. I decided this without any drama and without any panic. I decided this the way you decide to leave a card game when the game has stopped being fun. It was time to go. I did not need to know what had happened. I did not need to prove anything. I did not need to sit up there another night and see what would come. What was there, and I was leaving. That was my plan. I decided also that I was going to leave in an orderly way. I was not going to run out and get in the truck and drive off with the door of the cabin standing open and the stove full of hot coals. That would be a good way to burn the place down, and I had promised my uncle in that coffee shop in 1998 that I would take care of the cabin as long as I lived. So I would pack up my gear, and I would put out the fire in the wood stove, and I would empty the water jugs and turn off the propane at the tank, and I would close the shutters over the windows and lock the door, and then I would leave. I told myself, out loud, sitting at the table, "You are going to do this the right way, and you are going to do it now." I want to say something here. I do not think of myself as a brave man, but I do not think of myself as a coward either. I did not run from that cabin that morning. I walked out of it. I did not want to walk out of it. I wanted to run, but I walked, because it was what needed doing, and because if I ran I was afraid I would never come back to that country, and my uncle's cabin would sit up there and rot, and I would never in my life forgive myself for that. I want to also say that I did not in that hour believe that there was a monster in the woods. I did not believe in monsters. I still do not believe in monsters, not the way people usually mean the word. I believed, and I still believe, that something was there that I could not explain. That is not the same as a monster. A thing you cannot explain is a thing you have not thought about long enough or with the right information. I did not have the right information. I had a picture with no eyeshine, and a mark on a tree that was gone by afternoon, and a voice in my brother's voice, and steps in snow that did not leave tracks. I could not fit those things into any picture of the world I understood. So I decided to leave and go home and think about them from the safety of my kitchen table in Farmington, and if I could not explain them there, well then I would not explain them, and that would be that. I packed. I put my clothes back into my duffel bag. I put the rifle back into its case. I took the food out of the propane refrigerator and put it into a cooler with a bag of snow from the yard. I emptied the water jugs into the sink and let the pump run dry. I turned off the propane at the tank. I let the stove burn down for about 40 minutes while I finished packing everything else, and then I opened the door of the stove and I spread the coals out with a poker and I shoveled them into a metal ash bucket, which I carried outside and dumped into the snow 20 feet from the cabin and stirred with the poker until every last ember was out. I closed the shutters over the windows. I locked the back door. I made my final walk through the front room, and I picked up the 2 SD cards from the trail cameras on the table, and I put them in my shirt pocket next to my heart. I want to say now, because I forgot to say it earlier, that I did not go back out to my other trail cameras. 2 of my 5 cameras stayed out there in the woods, 1 on the saddle and 1 on the north end of the meadow near the rub line. I left them. They were not worth going after. If I ever go back up there, and I do not know if I will pick them up. If I do not, then they can stay strapped to those trees until the batteries die and the woods take them over. That is fine. I stood in the front room of the cabin. I looked at the table where I had eaten my last supper the night before. I looked at the stove, empty and cool now. I looked at the little coffee can on the mantel with the family photographs in it. I picked up the coffee can and I put it in my duffel bag. I did not know why I did this. It felt like the right thing to do. Then I picked up my duffel and my rifle case, and I stepped out onto the porch, and I locked the front door behind me. I want to describe the walk to the truck. It was maybe 20 feet from the front door to the driver's side of the truck. 20 feet. I made those 20 feet feel like half a mile. The sun was up now. It was a bright, cold morning. The snow lay clean and white over everything. The sky over the meadow was pale blue with a few high wispy clouds. There was no wind. It was a beautiful, quiet, still, ordinary November morning in the high country of northern New Mexico. And I walked out into it with my rifle in one hand and my duffel bag in the other, and I felt, the whole 20 feet, as though something was watching me. I do not know how else to say it. I do not know if I mean I felt it, in the ordinary way you feel a set of eyes on you in a crowded room. I do not know if I mean it the way a hunter feels the presence of a deer in the timber, without having seen it. I do not know what I mean. What I know is that walking those 20 feet from the porch of my uncle's cabin to the driver's side door of my Tacoma was the longest walk I have ever taken in my life, and I was fully expecting, at every step, to hear my brother's voice again, from the trees, from the meadow, from under the cabin, from behind me. I did not hear it, but I expected to, and that expectation, I want to tell you, was worse than actually hearing it would have been. I got to the truck. I put my duffel in the back seat. I put my rifle case on top of it. I got in the cab. I put the key in the ignition. I turned it. The engine caught on the first try. I have never been so grateful for a cold Toyota starter in my life. I sat for a moment with the truck idling. I looked out through the windshield at the aspen trees where I had seen the marks. I looked at the cabin. I looked at the meadow beyond the cabin, blank and white and calm. And in the timber at the far edge of the meadow, in a shadow between two tall spruce, about 300 yards off, I saw something move. I want to describe what I saw, because it is the only time in the whole business that I saw anything, and I want to be careful. What I saw was not clear. It was, at that distance, a shape at the base of the tree line, maybe 8 feet high, standing upright, standing as still as the trees around it, dark against the shadow behind it. Not a bear. A bear at that distance would look like a bear. It would look round and low, or if standing, front heavy. This was not that. This was tall and narrow. Its shoulders were narrower than a man's shoulders. Its head was too small. I sat in the truck and I looked at it for maybe 5 seconds. It did not move. I could not tell if it was looking at me. I could not tell if it had eyes. I lifted my binoculars out of the door pocket. I raised them. I found the spot. And in the second between me finding the spot and being able to focus, the shape was gone. The trees at the edge of the meadow were still. The shadow between them held nothing. If it had been anything, it had stepped back into the timber the moment I moved. If it had been nothing, then it had never been there at all. I did not check the shadow again. I put the truck in gear, and I turned around in the yard, and I drove out down the 2-track toward the forest road. I have never driven that road as slowly as I drove it that morning. There was fresh snow on it, and the truck could handle fresh snow, but the 2-track has some rough spots and some drop-offs and a couple of tight bends, and I was in no hurry to slide off. I drove it slowly and carefully, and the truck rumbled and rolled under me, and I did not turn on the radio, and I did not eat, and I did not speak. I gripped the wheel with both hands. At about the halfway point of the 2-track, right where it dips down through a little cut between 2 humps of rock, there is a place where the road comes close to the tree line on the driver's side. The trees are ponderosa there, big old ones, spaced maybe 8 or 10 feet apart. I have driven that stretch 400 times in 17 years. I know every tree. As I came down through the cut, I looked to my left, and in the space between 2 of the ponderosas, at the level of the truck window, about 50 feet off, I saw a face. I want to describe this, and then I want to stop describing things. The face was in the shadow between the trees. It was at the height a man's face would be if he were standing there. It was pale in the way that things are pale in shadow. It had 2 dark spots where the eyes would have been. I could see, or I thought I could see, the line of a mouth, closed, straight, expressionless. I could see, or I thought I could see, the shape of a jaw, and a neck, and a shoulder. It was my brother's face. I looked at it for about half a second, because that was all the time I had before the truck rolled past the gap in the trees, and the sight of it was gone. I did not stop the truck. I did not turn around. I did not slow down. I kept driving. I gripped the wheel, and I kept my eyes on the road, and I drove out of the cut and up the other side and along the 2-track and eventually onto the graded gravel of the forest road. When I hit the graded gravel, I let out a breath that felt like it had been in me for 2 hours. I drove down the forest road. I did not see anything else on the road. I did not see any deer. I did not see any elk. I did not see any coyotes. I did not see any birds. The whole forest, that morning, was silent and empty, or seemed silent and empty, and I drove through it with both hands on the wheel and my jaw locked and my eyes on the road, and I did not once look off the road, and I did not once check the rearview mirror. I got to the pavement at about 10:45. I turned right, toward Chama. Chama is a small town, maybe 1,000 people. It sits in a valley, and it has a main street with a couple of gas stations and a couple of little diners and the offices of the Cumbres and Toltec Scenic Railroad, which is a tourist train that runs in the summer. In November, in the off-season, Chama is quiet. I drove down the main street. I saw a woman walking a dog on the sidewalk. I saw a man loading grain sacks into the back of a Ford F-150. I saw a school bus with its lights on, coming out of the elementary school driveway. Ordinary things, life, people, going about their day, and I want to tell you it was like coming out of one country and into another. like walking from a place where the laws of nature had been briefly out of order into a place where they were still in force. I pulled into the Chevron on the north end of town, the same Chevron where I had bought coffee 8 days before. Elena was still at the counter. I went inside. She looked up. "You are back early," she said. "I am," I said. My voice sounded strange to me. Too calm, too flat, I said. "I decided to come down." She looked at me. She has known me for 17 years. She looked at my face and she nodded slowly and she said, "Ray, you look tired." "I am tired," I said. "I did not sleep much." She poured me a cup of coffee. She did not charge me for it. She said, "Do you want to sit down at the table?" I sat down at a little table by the window. I drank the coffee. I looked out the window at the main street of Chama, and at the sky over the mesas to the west, and at a raven flying across the parking lot with a piece of tortilla in its beak. I sat there for about an hour. Elena did not push me. She served 2 other customers. She wiped down the counter. She looked over at me every now and then. She did not say anything. Finally, I got up. I bought a bag of jerky and a bottle of water. I paid. As I was leaving, Elena said, "Ray, you be careful driving home." "I will," I said. She said, "Do not go back up there for a while." I stopped in the door. I turned and I looked at her. She was wiping the counter. She did not look up. She said, "My grandfather worked in the mill with your uncle in the 60s. He used to tell your uncle to be careful up there in the fall. Sometimes things get into that country in the fall. That is what he used to say. He would not go into that country in the fall, my grandfather, not for money." I did not know what to say. I looked at her for a moment. Then I said, "Okay." She said, "You come see me next summer." I said, "I will." I got in the truck and I drove out of Chama, south on 84 toward Espanola. I stopped once for gas at Dulce. I got home to Farmington at about 7 that night. My wife was at the front door before I had the truck in park. She had been watching for me. She hugged me for a long time without saying anything. I told her most of it that night. Not all of it. I have never told her about the face in the trees on the way out. That felt like something I did not want her to carry. I called Dean the next morning. I told him what I had heard at the cabin. I told him about the voice at 3:37 a.m. I told him about the pictures on the trail camera. I did not tell him about the face on the way out. I have not told him that. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Ray, I want you to know something." I said, "What?" He said, "At about 3:30 on the morning of the 8th, I woke up. I do not remember what woke me. I was in the bedroom. My wife was asleep next to me. I sat up in bed, and I had the strongest feeling that I needed to call your name. I do not know how to explain it. I did not do it. I sat there in bed for about 10 minutes, and then I lay back down and I went to sleep. I did not tell anyone. It felt too strange to tell anyone. I am telling you now because I think you should know." I did not say anything for a while. Then I said, "Dean, thank you for telling me." He said, "You are welcome." We have not talked about it since. I want to tell you a couple of last things. I still have the 2 SD cards. They are in a drawer in my kitchen. I have not looked at them since I got home. I know I should, because there might be things on them I did not see up at the cabin, but I have not been able to bring myself to put them back in the laptop. Someday I will, not now. I have not gone back to the cabin. It has been a year. My uncle's cabin is still up there, closed and locked, with the shutters over the windows and the propane off at the tank. 2 of my trail cameras are strapped to trees somewhere between the cabin and the ridge, and their batteries are surely dead by now, and their SD cards may or may not still be in them. I do not know what has been walking past those cameras in the year since I left. I do not know what has been walking around the cabin. I have not gone up to see, and I have not asked anyone to check for me. I have thought a lot about what happened. I have not come to any conclusion. I do not know what was in the woods that night. I do not know how it knew my brother's voice. I do not know how it knew my name. I do not know how it stood outside the window of my bedroom without leaving a footprint in the snow. I do not know what the marks on the tree were. I do not know what was in the picture on the trail camera without eye shine. I do not know if any of it was connected. I do not know if it was all connected. I have talked to a few people. My friend at the sheriff's department listened patiently and said he had heard stranger from other hunters in other parts of the country. He did not want to say much more than that. He said, "Ray, some things you leave in the woods, that is where they are. Do not bring them home." I asked him if he could tell me anything else. He said, You know as much as I know. I asked an old man who used to work with my uncle at the mill. He is close to 90 now, and he lives in a little house in Espanola. I sat with him at his kitchen table, and I told him some of what had happened, not all of it. He listened, he nodded a little. When I was done, he said, "In the fall, in that country, sometimes something comes down out of the high peaks. Do not go looking for it. It has already looked for you." I said, "What is it?" He said, "It does not have a name that means anything to say out loud. Not in English, not up here. You would not want to know it anyway." I said, "Was it a person?" He thought about that for a while. Then he said, "It was not a person when it stood outside your wall, but it might have been a person once." That is what my mother's family said. They said sometimes a person goes wrong, and after a while he is not a person anymore, but he is not anything else either. He walks in the country and he learns the voices of people, and if he catches you alone, he uses those voices to try to bring you outside. Do not go outside. Whatever you do in that country. If you hear your brother out there, and you know your brother is not there, do not go outside. I said, "I did not." He said, "That is why you are here." I thanked him and I drove home. I have not been to see him since. I have thought about that conversation many times. I do not know if he was right. I do not know if he was giving me a folk tale to help me sleep, the way people sometimes give a person a folk tale so that a terrible thing has a shape and a name and can be put in a box. I do not know if he believed it himself. I know he was a serious man, and not a joking one, and I know he had known my uncle for 40 years, and I know my uncle had never once in all the times we sat at that cabin together mentioned any of this to me. Which I do not know what to make of, either. Maybe my uncle knew things he did not want to pass on. Maybe he did not know anything. I want to end with this. Last week, sitting on my front porch in Farmington after supper, I had a moment when I thought I heard my brother's voice, from the alley behind my house, say my name. Just once. Just, Ray. I did not get up. I did not answer. I sat on my porch with my beer in my hand and I looked out at the yard and the streetlights and the cars going down the road and I waited. Nothing else came. After a while, I got up and I went inside and I locked the back door, which is a thing I do not usually do. It might have been nothing. It might have been a neighbor. It might have been the wind. It might have been my mind, working over something it cannot let go of, and putting a shape to a sound that did not have one. I hope so. I hope so. But I have not sat on the back porch after dark since that night. And I have not gone back to my uncle's cabin. And I will not, this November, go up into that country to hunt. Maybe next year. Maybe not. Whatever came out of the timber that night, calling in my brother's voice, is not something I need to see again. Once was plenty. Once was more than plenty. Once will last me the rest of my life. And that is the whole story. That is everything I know about it. That is everything I remember. If you have read this far, then you have as much information as I have. Do with it what you want. My name is Ray Cordell. I am 43 years old. And on the night of the 8th of November, in a cabin on a ridge above the Chama River in northern New Mexico, I heard my brother's voice, from 18 inches away, on the other side of a wall, calling my name. He was 940 miles away. I do not know what was on the other side of that wall. I hope I never find out. That is the full script, roughly 79,500 characters, split into 3 parts under 30,000 each. Style holds throughout. No contractions, no em-dashes, no markdown, sustained ambiguity, calm American vernacular, gradual escalation from ordinary routine to the wall scene and the final drive out. Let me know if you would like the YouTube package, titles, description, keywords, thumbnail prompt for this one. My name is Aaron Halstead. I am 41 years old. I live in a small ranch house outside of Marquette, Michigan, and I have been bow hunting the Upper Peninsula since I was 12 years old. My grandfather taught me. He was a mill worker at the old paper plant in Munising, and every fall from the middle of September until the last week of archery season in January, he was in the woods. When he passed in 2019, he left me his hunting camp. It was not much of a place. 20 acres of tag alder, spruce, and second-growth hardwood, tucked back on a 2-track spur road off Forest Road 216, well south of the Ottawa National Forest boundary, in the interior country between Kenton and Bruce Crossing. The cabin itself was a plywood and cedar shack with a metal roof, a wood stove, a propane cooktop, and a bunk bed my grandfather had built out of 2x4s in 1978. I loved that camp. I loved the silence out there. I loved how the closest neighbor was almost 4 miles away by road and only 2 miles as a raven would fly, if it cared to fly at all. I am telling this the way I would tell it to somebody sitting across from me at the counter at Sylvia's in Kenton. I am not going to try to make it sound bigger than it was. I am going to tell it the way it happened, and if it sounds like something you have heard before, I understand that. There are a lot of stories out of the Upper Peninsula. Some of them are old, some of them are older than the state. I did not believe in any of them before December of last year. I do not know what I believe now. I know what I saw, and I know what I heard, and I know I left that camp in the middle of the night, before the sun ever came up, and I have not been back since. My uncle went out in March to close the shutters properly and drain the propane line. He said the trail cameras were still up where I had strapped them. He said he did not touch them. He said he did not want to. I will get to that. I want to start with the routine, because the routine is the thing that makes the rest of it seem so wrong. If you hunt the UP in December, you do a certain set of things in a certain order, and you have done them so many times that you can do them half asleep. That was me. Half asleep, going through the motions I had been going through since I was a kid. My season had not been great. I had been chasing a specific buck since the middle of October, a wide 9-point with a broken G2 on his right side, and a jaw scar you could see through binoculars at 40 yards. I had him on camera 4 times in November on my back food plot, always after midnight, always alone, never during shooting light. My buddy Doyle, who runs a small excavating business out of Sidnaw, kept telling me the buck had gone nocturnal and I was wasting my time. Doyle is the kind of hunter who fills his tag on opening day of firearm season and spends the rest of the fall drinking coffee in his kitchen. He is not wrong very often, but I had the tag, I had the vacation days, and I had a feeling about that buck that I could not shake. So on December 9th I loaded up the truck. The truck is a 2018 Ford F-150. It has an 8-foot bed with a slide-in cap, a Boss Sport Duty plow on the front, 4-wheel drive that has never failed me, and a set of studded Cooper Discoverer tires that I run from November to April. I brought 2 totes of gear. One tote had my Matthews V3X33, my quiver of Easton Axis arrows with fixed-blade broadheads, my rangefinder, my binoculars, my Havalon knife, and a small dry bag with fire starters and extra hand warmers. The second tote had food: coffee, oatmeal, bacon, eggs, bread, cheese, a bag of red potatoes, 4 cans of chili, a jar of peanut butter, and 2 bottles of whiskey, which I never opened, and which came home with me half full because I never had a night in that camp that felt right for a drink. I brought 2 sets of long underwear, a pair of insulated bibs, a heavy Carhartt coat, a face mask, my grandfather's old wool hat, and my boots. I brought a Motorola GMRS radio and a Garmin InReach Mini for satellite messaging in case I got into trouble. I brought my old lever-action Marlin 336 in 30-30, chambered for a backup camp gun, because black bears in the Ottawa can be strange in a warm December, and because a rifle by the door is just a rifle by the door. I did not bring a dog. I used to bring my grandfather's old lab, Booker, when I still had him, but Booker went to sleep 3 winters ago, and I have not been able to replace him. I sometimes think if I had brought a dog, I would have known sooner. Dogs know before we know. I left Marquette a little after 9 in the morning on the 9th. I drove out on M28, went past Ishpemgen and Michigan, dropped south a bit near 3 Lakes, and stopped for gas and a sandwich in Kenton around noon. The gas station in Kenton is a small place with 1 pump that works and 1 pump that does not. The woman behind the counter is named Denise. She knows my grandfather's name, which she still uses when she talks to me, as in, "How is Ray's camp holding up?" I told her the camp was fine. I told her I was going in for a week to try for a big deer. She looked out the window at the sky and she said, quiet, like she was telling me something she thought I already knew. "There is weather coming." I said I knew. I had checked the National Weather Service before I left the house. There was a storm forming over Lake Superior, expected to slide south on Friday or Saturday. 6 to 12 inches, 30 to 40 mile-an-hour winds, wind chills down to 20 below. I told her I had the plow on the truck. I told her I would be fine. She nodded, the way people nod in that country when they are not going to argue with you but they also do not agree. Then she said, "You tell Doyle he still owes me for that transmission fluid." I said I would. That was our whole conversation. I would think about it later. I turned off M28 south of Kenton and drove 22 minutes on Forest Road 216, which is a wide gravel road that the county keeps plowed most of the winter. I turned off onto the two-track spur that leads to my camp. The two-track is not marked. My grandfather never let it be marked. There is a green metal gate with a heavy chain and a lock, and behind that gate is 1.5 miles of narrow, rutted, undulating trail through second-growth maple and beech, with a couple of low spots that fill with water in the fall and freeze into skating rinks by mid-December. I unlocked the gate, drove through, and locked it behind me. I like that step of the ritual. Locking the gate behind me feels like the point at which the rest of the world lets me go. I got to the camp a little before 3 in the afternoon. The sky was low and gray. The temperature was around 18 degrees Fahrenheit. There was maybe 2 inches of old snow on the ground, crusted over and refrozen many times, with fresh flurries starting up and blowing sideways when the wind gusted. I unloaded the truck. I lit the wood stove with kindling I had stacked in the corner from last year, threw in 2 split rounds of hard maple, and put a pot of coffee on the propane burner. Within 20 minutes the cabin was livable. Within an hour it was warm. The trail cameras were the next order of business. I had 4 of them out. 3 were Browning Strikeforce HD Pro X units, and 1 was an older Bushnell Core, which I keep as backup because the batteries last forever even in the cold. 2 cameras were on the eastern food plot, which is a half-acre I clear every summer with a hand scythe and plant with a brassica mix in August. 1 camera was on the western oak flat, watching a scrape line I had been running since October. 1 camera was on the doe trail behind the cabin, about 80 yards into the tag alders, on a scarred old birch that has been my anchor tree for 15 years. I like to check cameras the first evening in camp. I know some hunters say it is bad practice, that you should let the woods settle for a day or 2 before you start putting scent around. But I disagree, and I have been doing it my way for a long time. I pulled on my bibs, my coat, my hat, my gloves. I grabbed the SD card wallet from the tote, and I slid 4 fresh cards into it. I clipped my Haviland knife to my belt out of habit, took my binoculars, and started off down the trail into the tag alders behind the cabin. The first cam, on the doe trail, had 147 photographs on it from the previous 2 weeks. Most of them were nothing. Squirrels, a snowshoe hare, a pine marten one morning at 5:47 a.m., which I always love to see because they are rare enough that a photograph feels like a small gift. I skimmed the images later on my laptop with the cabin propane lantern hissing on the table. I did not think anything of what I saw at that first camera. I only bring it up now because when I looked back at that card, weeks later, I found something at the very end I had missed the first time through. But I am getting ahead of myself. The second and third cameras, on the east food plot, had a lot of deer, most of them does and yearlings, with a couple of small bucks in the mix. No sign of my 9-point. I was disappointed but not surprised. The fourth camera, on the West Oak Flat, had almost nothing. 62 photographs, all of them squirrels and turkeys, except for 2 photographs at 3:11 a.m. on December 4th of what I could see was clearly a deer, but the deer was running. That is unusual. Deer walk, deer feed, deer stand still and turn their heads. Deer do not run at 3:11 a.m. unless something is behind them. There was no third photograph, no follow-up frame, no picture of a coyote or a wolf trailing behind, which is what I would have expected in normal country. I made a note of it and put it out of my head. Coyotes trip cameras sometimes. Sometimes they do not trip cameras when they should. I have been fooled by coyotes before. I got back to the cabin as full night was starting to press down. That is one of the things about the UP in December. There is not really a sunset. There is a gradual softening of the gloom, and then the gloom just closes in on itself, and it is night. It is night by 5:15. It is night for a very long time. I made myself 2 eggs and bacon and cheese on toast, drank a 3rd cup of coffee, sat at the table with my laptop and skimmed the cards. I sent Doyle a text on the inReach saying I was in and that I would sit the east plot in the morning. He replied within 3 minutes. He always keeps his inReach on the counter in his kitchen. His reply said, "You are wasting your time on that buck. Sit the west stand. I will drive out Saturday and hunt with you. Bring good coffee." That was Doyle, efficient, a little rude. I texted back that I would sit the east plot anyway, and that he could sit whatever he wanted when he came out. I closed the laptop. I threw another round on the fire. I went to bed at 9:30. I say I went to bed. What I mean is that I lay down on the bottom bunk with my clothes on and pulled a wool blanket up to my chin and listened to the wind for a while. That is another thing about camp. You do not go to bed the way you go to bed in your house. You lie down and you listen. You hear the wind push the tin roof and rattle a loose fastener up by the ridge cap. You hear the wood stove pop and settle as the coals collapse into themselves. You hear the little things scratch and skitter in the ceiling insulation, because a hunting camp is never really unoccupied. It has residents you did not choose. On the 9th of December, I did not hear anything unusual. I heard the wind. I heard the stove. I heard something small run along a rafter above me. I slept. The next morning I was up at 4:15. I made coffee, ate an oatmeal packet, dressed in the cold, and walked out to the east food plot with my bow. My stand there is a hang on 12 feet up in a mature yellow birch. I climbed it in the pitch black with my headlamp on red mode, clipped in with my safety harness, hoisted my bow, and settled in to wait for shooting light. It was 14 degrees. There was a light wind out of the northwest, which was perfect for the stand. Snow began falling around 6:30, the way snow falls in the UP sometimes, in slow, spiraling, unhurried flakes, and I remember thinking it was one of the most beautiful mornings I had ever spent in the woods. At 7:22 I had 4 does come out of the western tag alders, feed at the plot for 12 minutes, and drift off to the south. At 7:41 a young 4-point stepped out, browsed for a while, and left the same way. At 8:50 I saw something that I did not understand at the time, but which I have thought about many times since. Across the plot, in the shadow at the base of the tag alders, I saw movement. I raised my binoculars. It was a deer, a doe, standing at the edge of the cover. Her ears were up. Her whole body was tight. She was staring, not into the plot, but into the cover behind her, at something on the other side of the tag alders, in the direction of my west stand. She stood there for a long time, 2 full minutes, 3. She never fed. She never moved forward into the plot. And then she turned, in a single hard motion, and blew, that loud sudden snort a doe makes when she is scared, and she bounded south and disappeared. She never once looked in my direction. Something was on the west side of that thicket. I could not see it, I could not smell it, I could not hear it, but she could. Whatever she saw put her body into a state of alarm that had nothing to do with me. I sat in the stand for another 2 hours, hoping the buck would come through, but nothing else moved. Not a squirrel, not a chickadee. The woods went silent, in the way woods go silent when there is something present that does not belong. I climbed down at 11, walked back to the cabin, made lunch, and told myself it had been a coyote. I told myself the woods are always full of coyotes. That afternoon I pulled the West Stand card. I told myself I was checking on batteries. I told myself it was routine. I was lying to myself. I wanted to know what had been in that cover. The West Stand camera had 182 new photographs. Almost all of them were from the same period, between 8:40 and 9:05 that morning. There were 14 photographs of the doe I had seen. She was standing at the very edge of the frame, closest to the camera, with her head turned. She was not looking at the camera. She was looking past it. In frame after frame, she is looking past it, into a section of the cover that the camera did not capture. And then, on frame 166, at 8:57 a.m., the camera captured a leg. I do not know how else to describe it. It was at the very edge of the frame, on the left side, and it was only a leg from about the middle of the thigh downward. The rest of the body was out of frame. The photograph was taken through falling snow, which softened everything and made it harder to see. The leg was thin, very thin, longer than I would expect a deer leg to be, and jointed the wrong way, or so I thought at first. Though when I looked again, I decided it was not really jointed the wrong way. I had only been looking at it in a strange angle. The skin was gray, not brown, not tan. Gray, the way a birch trunk is gray in the winter, with dark blotches on it. I could not see a hoof, and I could not see a foot. I could only see the leg, from thigh to where it disappeared behind a stand of small saplings. I sat at the table with my laptop and I looked at that image for a very long time. I zoomed in, I zoomed out. I told myself it was a deer whose body was mostly hidden. I told myself it was a moose calf, which would be unusual but not impossible in that area. I told myself the gray was an artifact of the infrared flash and the falling snow. I told myself many things. None of them settled me. I did not tell Doyle about the photograph. I do not know exactly why. I think I was embarrassed. I had already been out at camp for one full day, and I was already seeing things I could not explain. Doyle would have laughed at me, that is what I told myself. In truth, I think I did not want to say it out loud, because saying a thing out loud makes it real. I ate dinner. I sat by the stove. I read a paperback my grandfather had left on the shelf, a Louis L'Amour Western called The Lonesome Gods, which I had read before, twice. I turned in early. I slept badly. I dreamed, I think. I do not remember the dream. I remember waking up around 3 in the morning to a sound I could not place. It was a low sound, almost too low to hear, more felt than heard. It was outside. It was not the wind. It was not the tin roof. It was a low, sustained, resonant sound, like somebody breathing out slowly, or like a large animal moaning very softly in its sleep. It came from the direction of the tag alders behind the cabin. I lay in the bunk and I listened. It went on for maybe 30 seconds, and then it stopped, and I did not hear it again. I told myself it was a moose. There are moose in the Ottawa, not many, but there are. I told myself it was a moose. I said it out loud in the cabin, in the dark, with the wood stove ticking. I said it as if saying it would make it true. The next morning was Friday. I hunted the east plot again. Nothing came in. I mean nothing. I sat from 5:30 until 11, and I did not see a squirrel, and I did not see a blue jay, and I did not see a chickadee, and I did not see a snowshoe hare, and I did not see a single doe. The plot was silent. The woods were silent. The wind picked up around 9 and started blowing hard out of the northwest, and the snow started coming sideways, and by 10:30 I was miserable in the tree, and I knew the storm the woman at the gas station had told me about was starting to slide in. I climbed down and walked back to the cabin. I brewed coffee. I sent Doyle a message on the inReach. I said, "Storm hitting early, still coming Saturday?" He replied fast. He said, "Leaving Sidnaw around 6 a.m. will bring the sled if the 2-track is drifted. Keep the coffee on." I said I would. I put the inReach back on the table. I looked out the front window of the cabin at the trees. The snow was coming down harder. The wind was picking up. The trees were bending. It was going to be a rough afternoon. I decided to pull the doe trail camera before the storm got worse. I did not want to leave it up in a heavy blow with wet snow on the housing. I put my gear back on, took a fresh SD card, and hiked the 80 yards behind the cabin into the tag alders. The wind was loud in there, in a way it does not sound loud from inside a warm cabin. It made the small birches creak. It made the tag alders knock against each other. I got to the camera, pulled the old SD card, put the fresh one in, and walked back. I made lunch. 2 grilled cheese sandwiches, a bowl of tomato soup, another cup of coffee. I sat at the table and I put the SD card in the laptop and I clicked through the images. Squirrels, hare, a fox at 4:04 a.m. on December 2nd, and then, on frame 91, at 2:33 a.m. on the 10th of December, which was the morning after I had arrived at the cabin, I found a photograph. It was not a deer. It was not a bear. It was not a moose. It was standing on the doe trail, 40 feet from the camera, facing the camera. It was tall. In the frame, using the trail width as a reference, I estimated it stood at least 7 feet high. It was thin. Its arms hung down past what should have been its knees. Its head was small in proportion to its body. Its eyes reflected the infrared flash in a pale, washed-out way, like frost on a windshield. It looked, at a first glance, human. At a second glance, it did not look human at all. Its shoulders were too narrow. Its chest was too shallow. Its skin, or its coat, or whatever was covering it, was pale, patched with the same gray blotching I had seen on the leg in the West Stand photograph. It was watching the camera. It knew the camera was there. That is the thing I keep coming back to. It knew the camera was there. I sat at the table. I did not move. I did not click to the next frame. I sat there, looking at that photograph, with my tomato soup going cold in front of me, for I do not know how long. 10 minutes, 20. My hands were shaking a little bit. I told myself, in a voice inside my head, that it was a person, that some crazy person had wandered into the woods in December and stood on my grandfather's doe trail at 2:30 in the morning and stared into the camera. I told myself that was worse than any animal, because a person is worse than any animal, and I should be afraid of the person, and I should call somebody. I told myself many things. I do not remember believing any of them. I clicked to the next frame. It was empty. The trail was empty. The figure was gone. The gap between frame 91 and frame 92 was 17 minutes. Whatever had been standing on the trail had stood there for 17 minutes and only tripped the camera once and then left without tripping it again on the way out. I closed the laptop. I stood up. I went to the door of the cabin and I looked out through the small dirty window that my grandfather had installed in 1974, and I looked at the tree line at the edge of the clearing, and I looked at the storm coming in, and I said, out loud, I need to go home. I did not go home. I want to be clear about that. I want to be honest about it, because I have thought a lot about what I could have done differently, and this is one of the moments I keep coming back to. At 2:45 in the afternoon on Friday, December 11th, I saw the photograph, and I said out loud to myself that I needed to go home, and I did not go home. I had 4 reasons. The first reason was that the storm was already too close. The wind was gusting at 35 miles an hour, and the snow was thick, and I did not know how long it would take me to get down the 2-track, and I did not want to slide off into a ditch a mile from any help. The second reason was that Doyle was coming in the morning, and I could not raise him quickly on the inreach with the storm coming, and I did not want him to drive all the way out from Sidnaw and find the camp empty and the gate closed. The third reason was that I did not fully believe what I had seen. I told myself the photograph was a trick of the flash, or a person, or a bear standing up, or a deer at an angle. I told myself I was being weak. My grandfather would have laughed at me, is what I told myself. The fourth reason was the buck. I had a tag in my pocket, and I had a big buck on my mind, and I did not want to admit to myself that I was going to walk away from him because of a photograph of a figure I could not identify. So I stayed. The storm came in hard between 3 and 4 in the afternoon. By 4:30, the wind was steady out of the north-northwest at somewhere around 40 miles an hour, and the snow was coming down heavy and dense and full of ice pellets that clicked against the cabin windows. The temperature had dropped from 18 at daybreak to 7 above by mid-afternoon, and it was still falling. I loaded the wood stove until the top of it glowed a dull orange, and I sat in the chair next to it with my laptop closed on the table and my hands on my knees, and I tried to think clearly. I want to explain, before I keep going, what a person actually thinks about in a moment like that. Because in a movie or in a book, the person always thinks about the monster. In real life, my brain kept drifting away from the photograph and onto small practical concerns. I thought about whether I had enough drinking water in the jug, and whether I should bring more snow in to melt. I thought about whether I had enough dry firewood inside, or whether I would need to make another trip out to the woodshed before it got worse. I thought about the propane tank on the side of the cabin, and whether the regulator would freeze if the wind got any harder. I thought about how I would drive out in the morning if a foot of snow fell on the 2-track. Those were the thoughts my mind stayed with. The other thing, the thing on the doe trail, I kept pushing to the edge of my mind, because I did not know what to do with it. I did not have a category for it, so my brain did what a brain does. It focused on the things it could act on. I made the extra wood trip while I still had some light. The woodshed is a lean-to attached to the north side of the cabin, 10 feet away, and it is stacked with maybe 2 cords of split hardwood. I filled the plastic sled I keep for the purpose, dragged it around to the front door, and stacked the wood inside along the interior wall behind the stove. It took me 3 trips. On the second trip, standing at the woodshed, I looked back across the clearing at the tag alders behind the cabin, and the wind was blowing so hard and the snow was so thick that the tree line was only a suggestion. I could not see individual trunks. I could only see a wall of moving white and a smear of shadow behind it. It looked for a moment as if the shadow behind the white was leaning forward, watching. Then the wind gusted harder and the whole line disappeared into whiteout. I told myself I was seeing what I wanted to see. I went inside. I bolted the door. I want to describe the cabin because the cabin will matter. It is a rectangular structure, 16 feet by 24 feet, oriented with the long axis running east to west. The front door is on the south wall with a small covered porch. There are 3 windows. One is on the south wall, next to the door, and looks out at the clearing and the 2-track. One is on the east wall, above the small kitchen counter and propane cooktop, and looks out at the woodshed and the east tree line. One is on the north wall, above the bunk bed, and looks directly out at the doe trail and the tag alders. There is no window on the west wall, because my grandfather insisted the west wall was for the wood stove and the stovepipe and nothing else. The interior is 1 room. There is a small enclosed toilet closet in the northeast corner, with a 5-gallon bucket toilet and a curtain, Because there is no plumbing. There is no electricity. The propane lanterns hang from hooks in the rafters. The bunk bed is against the north wall. The table and chairs are against the south wall by the front window. The wood stove and its raised brick pad are on the west wall. The kitchen counter is against the east wall. It is not much. It has been enough for 50 years. The window that would matter most was the north window, above the bunk. It was small, maybe 18 inches wide by 12 inches tall, single pane, with a plywood shutter my grandfather had built to close over it from the inside in bad weather. I had not closed the shutter on that window the first 2 nights, because there had been no need. I closed it now. I ate dinner around 6:30, a can of chili, half a bag of tortilla chips, a glass of water. I sat at the table with the front window on my left, the lantern hissing above me, the stove roaring behind me on the west wall. Outside, the storm was full. The wind was howling around the corners of the cabin in that long, moaning way that a hard UP storm has. The snow was piling up on the porch railing in ridges. Visibility was less than 50 feet. I could not see the truck, which was parked 25 feet away. At 7:15, I heard the first noise. It was outside, and it was on the north side of the cabin, behind the bunk bed, on the wall where I had just closed the shutter. It was not a knock. It was a scrape. It sounded like a fingernail dragged very slowly down the outside of the plywood, from the top of the wall to the bottom. It lasted maybe 5 seconds. Then it stopped. I sat still. I put down my spoon. I listened. There was nothing but the wind for maybe 2 full minutes. Then it came again. Same wall, same slow scrape. Longer this time. 10 seconds. 12. My first thought was a tree branch. My second thought was that there is no tree that close to the north wall of the cabin. My grandfather had cleared a 15-foot strip on all 4 sides of the cabin, and that clearing is still maintained. There is no branch that could be reaching the north wall. My third thought was a deer. A deer will sometimes brush a cabin wall in a storm, seeking shelter. Except the sound was not a brush. It was a scrape, a drag, a deliberate drag of one hard object down another hard object. And it had happened twice, at the same spot, with a rhythm to it. I stood up. I walked over to the north wall. I stood next to the bunk bed. I put my ear against the plywood shutter. I listened. Nothing. Just the wind, just the tin roof shifting and creaking above me. Then, on the other side of the wall, no more than 18 inches from my ear, I heard something breathe. I want to be careful how I describe this, because a person who has been startled will always exaggerate afterward. I have thought about this moment 100 times, and I do not think I am exaggerating it. What I heard was a slow, sustained exhale, low in pitch, with a slight rasp at the end of it, as if there were something in the throat that vibrated when the breath went past. It was one breath. It was long. It went on for maybe 5 or 6 seconds. And when it stopped, there was no inhale, or the inhale was too quiet for me to hear. That was the thing that unsettled me the most. Just the one long exhale, and then silence. I stepped back from the wall. I walked, quietly, to the west side of the cabin, and I picked up the Marlin 336. I chambered around. I sat down at the table with the rifle across my lap, and I stared at the north wall, at the shutter, at the space above the bunk bed. I sat there for a long time. I did not eat any more of the chili. I did not drink any more water. I sat, and I listened, and I waited. Nothing else happened for about an hour. The wind kept howling. The stove kept ticking. At 8:35, I made myself get up and refill the stove and check the propane lantern. I did not want the lantern to run down. I did not want to be sitting in the dark. I filled the stove with 3 big rounds of hard maple, closed the damper down, and sat back at the table. At about 9 o'clock, I heard the voice for the first time. It was outside. It was distant. It came from the direction of the tag alders, but from farther in, maybe 100 yards deep or more. It was very faint, and it was carried unevenly on the wind, so that I heard fragments of it, and then lost them, and then heard them again. It was a human voice. It was a man's voice. It said, or seemed to say, my name. Aaron. I froze. I sat with the rifle across my lap and the stove ticking behind me, and I listened. Aaron. It was the same voice. It said the name twice in the space of maybe 10 seconds. It was not shouting. It was not calling loudly. It was speaking at what I would call a normal volume, and I could only hear it because the wind was carrying it in gusts. My first thought was Doyle. It sounded, in a general way, like Doyle. It had a similar pitch and cadence. But Doyle was in Sidnaw. Doyle was not coming until the morning. Doyle would not have driven out in the middle of a blizzard, and if he had, he would have come up to the front door and pounded on it. He would not be standing 100 yards deep in the tag alders behind the cabin, calling my name. I moved to the east window, above the kitchen counter. I looked out at the woodshed, at the storm. Nothing. The clearing was empty. I moved to the front window. I looked out at the two-track, at the truck. Nothing. The truck was a lump of white in the storm. The two-track disappeared into white after 20 feet. Aaron. Again. Same voice, same cadence. Maybe slightly closer, or maybe the wind had shifted. I could not tell. I picked up the inReach. I typed a message to Doyle. Are you outside my camp right now? I waited. 3 minutes. 5. He would be watching his phone. He always was. 7 minutes. 10. The inReach beeped. His message came in. No. At home. Why? I typed back. Hearing someone calling my name outside cabin. Thought maybe you. The reply took 2 minutes. Not me. Do not go outside. Lock up. Keep the Marlin. Call the sheriff on the inReach if you need to. I can be there by daylight if you want. I stared at his message. Doyle is not a man who tells you to lock up and call the sheriff. Doyle is a man who tells you to stop being a baby and go check the noise. The fact that he had responded that way told me something. It told me that even from 35 miles away, in his kitchen, reading my 2 lines, Doyle had understood something I had not yet let myself understand. I did not reply for a few minutes. I sat with the inReach in my hand and I listened to the wind. I did not hear the voice again for a long time. At about 9:45, the trail cam alert function on my phone chimed. I want to explain this because it will matter. 2 of my 4 cameras have a Wi-Fi and Bluetooth handshake feature. When I am within about 80 feet of the camera, and when the camera has taken a photograph in the last 2 hours, it can push a low-resolution thumbnail to my phone the next time I pair with it. It is not real-time, it is not cellular, it is just a short-range handshake. When my phone chimes with a thumbnail from a trail camera, it means one of 2 things. Either I am within 80 feet of the camera and it just pushed me a recent image, or I am at the edge of range and it pushed me an image from earlier. Since I was inside the cabin, and the cabin was inside the 80-foot handshake range of the Doe trail camera, and the Doe trail camera was the only camera within range, that meant the Doe trail camera had taken a photograph within the last 2 hours. I looked at the thumbnail on my phone screen. It was a photograph from 9:17 p.m. that night, less than half an hour before. It was on the Doe trail. It was infrared, black and white, with heavy snow visible in the frame. There was a figure standing on the trail. It was the same figure I had seen from the previous morning's card. Same body type, same tall thin frame, same disproportionate limbs, same pale mottled skin. But this time it was closer. It was maybe 25 feet from the camera. And it was facing the camera, and its mouth, or what I thought was its mouth, was open. It was open too wide. The bottom of the jaw was hanging down in a way I have not seen in any animal. I put the phone face down on the table. I got up. I walked to the wood stove. I put my hand on the metal of the flue pipe, feeling the heat come off it. I stood there, I do not know for how long. I looked at the flue pipe and I thought about my grandfather, and I thought about being 12 years old and coming to this camp for the first time, and I thought about a lot of things. Then I sat back down at the table and I picked up the phone and I looked at the thumbnail again. It was still there, the figure, its mouth open, not looking at the camera this time, looking, it seemed, at the cabin. Its eyes reflected the infrared flash in that same pale, washed-out way, as if a light had been shone directly into them at close range. I typed to Doyle. Camera behind cabin just pushed a photo. There is something out there, not a person. Doyle's reply came in 1 minute. How far from the cabin? I typed back. 80 yards. Camera on Doe trail. It is on the trail. Doyle's reply. Load rifle. Do not open door. Do not go outside. Do not answer any voice. Stay by stove. I am leaving now. I typed. Storm too bad. Do not come. Doyle's reply. Leaving now. Plow truck. 2 hours to your gate. Keep Marlin loaded. I will call sheriff on the way and have them send someone up 216. I put the inReach down. I sat with the rifle across my lap and the phone face down on the table, and I listened. For a while I heard nothing but the storm. Then, at about 10:40, I heard the voice again. Closer, much closer. It was, I estimated, at the edge of the clearing behind the cabin, maybe 40 feet away, on the near side of the tag alders. Aaron. It sounded exactly like Doyle. I want to say this clearly. It sounded for a few seconds exactly like Doyle Catola. The same pitch, the same slight nasal quality, the same little upward tick on the second syllable of my name that Doyle has always had, because he grew up in a household that spoke Finnish, and it left a faint accent on his English that most people never notice, but I notice because I have known him since we were 16. Except Doyle was in Sydney. Doyle had just 4 minutes before told me he was getting in his truck. Doyle was 100 miles away. Or he was standing 40 feet from my cabin, in a whiteout, in a December storm, calling my name. I did not answer. I did not move. I gripped the marlin harder. I heard the voice call once more. Aaron, open the door. That was the moment. That was the moment when I understood, in a way that was not intellectual but was something deeper, that whatever was outside was not Doyle. Doyle would never in his life say, open the door, in that tone. Doyle would say, Halstead, you dumb bastard, let me in. Doyle would be laughing. Doyle would be pounding on the wood. Doyle would be swearing about the wind. This voice was flat. This voice was even. This voice was, in some quality I still have trouble describing, pretending to be a voice. It was like listening to a good impression that misses one small thing. The vowel was slightly wrong. The rhythm was slightly off. It sounded like Doyle the way a photograph sounds like a person. Close, but not the thing itself. I stayed silent. I did not move. There was a long pause. The wind kept howling. The tin roof kept knocking. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. I could hear the stove ticking behind me. Then the voice said, Aaron, it is cold. Open the door. And then, a moment later, in the same voice, Aaron, please. I want to describe what a person feels in a moment like that. I do not have the right words. I will say that my body understood something before my mind did. My legs went numb. My hands went hot. I felt my stomach clamp down on itself. I felt tears come into my eyes that I did not ask for and did not want. And the whole time, some part of my brain was still trying to make it be Doyle, to make it be a person, to make it be a real, ordinary, terrible thing, a lost man in a blizzard, because that would be a thing I could act on. I could open the door. I could pull the man inside. I could put him next to the stove. I could save him. That would be a real thing. That would be the kind of trouble that made sense. I did not open the door. I sat and I listened, and the voice did not speak again for a long time. Then, at about 11:15, I heard something walk around the cabin. It was quiet, most of it, because the snow muffled its footfalls, but it walked. It walked all the way around the perimeter of the cabin. I heard the crunch of its steps on the crusted snow of the clearing. I heard it pause on the east side, near the woodshed. I heard it pass along the south wall, behind me, near the front door. It did not knock. It did not scrape. It just walked, steadily, deliberately. Its steps were not fast. It was not in a hurry, and its steps were not the steps of a bear or a moose. I have heard bears. I have heard moose. A bear does not walk in a rhythm. A bear shuffles and rolls. A moose crashes and hesitates. This walked, steady, on 2 legs, long strides, longer strides than a man. I counted. Between the east wall and the south wall, I counted 6 steps. Between the south wall and the west wall, I counted 7. Between the west wall and the north wall, I counted 7 again. Between the north wall and back to the east wall, I counted 6. 26 steps to walk the perimeter of my 16 by 24-foot cabin. I did the math in my head, sitting there with the rifle. 26 steps for a total perimeter of 80 feet. That gave a stride of roughly 3 feet each. For a person of ordinary height, 5'9", maybe 6 foot, stepping in soft crusted snow at a walking pace, that is a normal stride. So on the math it was consistent with a person. But something about the sound of the steps, the depth of them, the weight in them was wrong. They landed heavy. They landed like a person twice the size of a normal person, or like a person who was not distributing weight the way a person distributes weight. I do not know how else to say it. The steps sounded, if I have to put words to it, hungry, which I know does not make sense. I could not tell you what a hungry step sounds like. I could only tell you that if you had been sitting in that cabin with me, you would have known what I meant. The steps completed the circuit twice, 2 full circuits around the cabin, and then on the 3rd circuit, at the northeast corner, they stopped, and then they moved back to the north wall. And then whatever it was stood, or hunched, or crouched, or however it stood, at the north wall of the cabin, right behind the bunk bed, right where I had heard the breathing an hour before. And it began to whisper. It was low, it was constant, it was in a voice that sometimes sounded like Doyle, and sometimes sounded like my grandfather, and sometimes sounded like a woman I did not recognize, and sometimes sounded like nothing human. It whispered for a long time. Some of it was my name, over and over. Some of it was words I could not make out. Some of it, and this is the part I will never forget, was in a language I did not know. It was not English. It was not Ojibwe, which I have heard some of because there is a strong Ojibwe presence in that country. It was not French. It was old, is the only way I can describe it. It sounded old the way a rock face sounds old when the wind moves across it. It sounded like a language that was in the woods before there were people to hear it. I sat. I did not move. At some point, and I could not tell you when, the whispering stopped. I looked at my watch. It was 12:47 a.m. on the 12th of December. I had been sitting at the table with the rifle for close to 4 hours. I texted Doyle on the inReach. Still here, still outside, do not know where, stop talking, how far are you? Doyle's reply came in 8 minutes. Just past Bruce Crossing, weather bad. Sheriff dispatch says a deputy is running up 216 from you inside. I will meet him at your gate. Do not move. Do not answer any voice. Do not open door. 2 hours at most. I sat. At 1:22 a.m., the north window shutter, which I had closed and latched from the inside, moved. I saw it move. I was watching it. It shifted, just slightly, from the outside, as if something were testing it, as if something were curious about it. The latch held, the plywood held, but the shutter moved. It shifted maybe a quarter of an inch inward, and then it settled back. I raised the Marlin. I aimed at the shutter. My hands were shaking, but I aimed. I did not fire. I did not want to fire, because I did not know what was on the other side, and I did not want the sound of a rifle shot in a cabin to be the last thing I ever heard. The shutter did not move again. I do not know how long I sat with the rifle aimed at the north wall shutter. It might have been 10 minutes. It might have been half an hour. My arms began to shake in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the weight of a Marlin 336 held up at shoulder level by a man who had not slept. I lowered the rifle. I rested the stock on my thigh. I kept the muzzle aimed generally toward the north wall. The wind was howling louder than before. I remember checking the barometer on my inReach, which I do not usually think about, but I checked it that night. The pressure had dropped almost a full inch since I had arrived at camp on the 9th. That is a bad storm. That is the kind of storm that shuts down whole counties. I remember thinking, in a numb kind of way, that even if Doyle was on the way, the storm might turn him back. I remember hoping the storm would turn him back. I did not want him coming into whatever this was. It was one thing for me to be in it. I had let myself be in it. Doyle had not. At 1:41 a.m., I heard the voice for the last time in the tag alders. It came from the north side, from the direction of the doe trail, from a little farther out than before, maybe 80 yards deep. It said, in a voice that was not Doyle and was not my grandfather and was not a voice I recognized at all, one long sentence in the same old language it had whispered at the wall. I do not know what the sentence meant. I do not know what language it was. I could not repeat it now if I tried. The sounds do not stay in my head. What I remember about it is that it had a rhythm to it, a cadence, and it ended with something that was almost a question. Whatever it was not calling me anymore. It was speaking to something else, or it was speaking to no one, or it was speaking to the woods. I do not know. Then there was silence. The wind kept blowing. The stove kept ticking. I heard the doe trail cam alert on my phone chime, and I almost did not pick up the phone because I was afraid of what would be on the thumbnail. But I picked it up. I looked. The thumbnail was of the empty trail. There was no figure. There was only the snow and the tag alders and the tracks going away. The tracks. I could see them, at the edge of the frame, going up the trail away from the camera, deeper into the tag alders, deeper into the woods. 2 prints, then 2 more, then 2 more, bipedal, long stride, deep, going away. I put the phone down. I sat. I did not move. At 2:07 a.m., the inReach beeped. Doyle. At your gate. Sheriff deputy behind me, coming up the 2-track, plow first. I typed back. Hurry. I stood up. I was stiff. My legs did not want to work. I walked to the front window and I looked out. I could not see the two-track. I could not see anything but blowing snow. At 2:29 a.m., I saw headlights, two sets, coming up the two-track. One high and wide, the plow truck. One narrower, behind it, the deputy's SUV. The plow truck came into the clearing, its headlights sweeping across the front of the cabin, and I saw Doyle behind the wheel through the windshield, hunched forward, his face tight. He pulled up next to my truck. The deputy pulled up behind him. I unlocked the front door. I was crying. I did not know I was crying until I felt it on my face. Doyle came up onto the porch with his shotgun in his hands, a Remington 870 he keeps in a rack in his truck, and he came through the door, and he looked at me, and he did not say anything. He just came inside. The deputy came up behind him. She was a young woman, maybe 30, in the tan and green uniform of the Ontonagon County Sheriff's Department, with a duty belt and a Glock and a wool cap pulled down over her ears. Her name was Deputy Callahan. I remember that because when she introduced herself, she said, "Deputy Callahan, Ontonagon County," in the flat professional voice they use, and it felt like something from the ordinary world, and I almost broke down again from hearing it. I told them what had happened. I told them almost everything. I showed them the photograph on the camera thumbnail. I showed them the trail cam photograph from the previous morning. I showed them the ones on the laptop from the West Stand card. Doyle looked at all of it. He did not say anything for a long time. Deputy Callahan looked at them too. She had a professional face on. She was not going to react in front of me, but I could see her jaw set. "Have you fired the rifle?" she asked me. "No," I said. "Has anything tried to enter the cabin?" The north shutter moved, but it did not open. The latch held. She nodded. She keyed her shoulder mic and she called in her position and her status to dispatch. She said she was on scene. She said the occupant was safe. She said there was possibly an intruder in the area. She said conditions were adverse. She asked for backup at her discretion. The dispatcher said she would try to raise the state police out of Wakefield. Doyle looked at me. He said, "You are coming home with me." I said, "Yes." Deputy Callahan said, "Sir, I need to look around the exterior before we do anything else." Doyle said, "With respect, Deputy, I do not think you should go out there alone." Deputy Callahan looked at him. She did not argue. She said, "You are welcome to come with me. Sir, please stay inside. Keep the rifle." Doyle grabbed a headlamp from his coat pocket, checked the shotgun, and followed her out. I stood by the front door with the Marlin. I watched their headlamps in the storm. They went around the east side of the cabin first. Their lights disappeared behind the corner. I heard them talking, very faintly, over the wind. I heard Doyle say something sharp. I heard Deputy Callahan say, "Back up." I heard the metallic clack of a shotgun being racked. They came back around the west side of the cabin about 6 minutes later. When they came in the front door, they were pale in a way I do not know how to describe. Deputy Callahan's face was the color of paper. Doyle's face was almost gray. He came inside and he shut the door, and he did not look at me for a moment. "What?" I said. Deputy Callahan said, "You need to leave, right now." Doyle said, "There are prints all the way around the cabin. Bipedal, long stride, not human." Deputy Callahan said, "There are also prints coming up onto the porch, and prints at the north window. Something stood there for a long time. There is a depression in the snow where it stood." Doyle looked at me. He said, "Aaron, get your bag. Get anything you cannot leave. Everything else stays. We go now." I did not argue. I did not need to. I moved. I threw my clothes into my duffel. I grabbed the laptop and the SD cards and my InReach and my phone. I grabbed my bow case because I could not leave a Matthews in an empty cabin in December for the mice to find. I did not grab the food. I did not grab the tote of gear. I did not grab the paperback my grandfather had left on the shelf, and I still regret that. I put on my boots and my coat. Doyle killed the propane lantern. He did not damper the wood stove down all the way. He left it burning. He said, quietly, "Let it burn out on its own. I do not want to hear a coal pop while we are trying to get out of here." Deputy Callahan led the way out. Doyle followed with the shotgun. I followed Doyle with the rifle in one hand and my bow case in the other and my duffel over my shoulder. The wind hit me like a wall coming off the porch. Deputy Callahan waited by her SUV. Doyle went to his truck. He said to me, "I will lead. You follow in your rig. Do not stop for anything. Do not slow down. If you get stuck, I will come back for you. Do not get out." I said, "Yes." I loaded the truck. I threw the duffel and the bow case in the back seat. I put the Marlin in the front passenger seat within reach. I got in the driver's seat. I turned the key. The F-150 started on the first try, as it always does. I put it in four-wheel drive high. I flicked on the wipers and the defrost and the fog lamps. I want to say something now that I have not said to anyone but Doyle. As I sat in the truck with the engine running, waiting for Doyle to pull out ahead of me, I looked at the north side of the clearing, toward the tag alders. And in that split second, in the swirl of blowing snow and the shifting cone of the headlights and the yellow glow from Deputy Callahan's amber flashers, I saw something at the edge of the tree line. It was standing. It was tall. It was thin. It was pale. It was watching us. It was about 120 feet away. I saw it for maybe 2 seconds, maybe less. The snow was thick enough that I could only see an outline, but I could see the outline clearly enough to know that it was a shape that should not have been standing there. Its head was low, almost between its shoulders. Its arms hung too long. The wind was blowing snow across it in a curtain, and it did not move to shield itself. It just stood. It just stood and watched. I did not say anything to Doyle. I did not say anything to Deputy Callahan. I did not honk. I did not point. I did not blink. I looked away from it, straight forward, and I gripped the steering wheel with both hands, and I waited for Doyle to move. Doyle's plow rig pulled forward. He turned on the two-track. He started down. His plow lifted a curtain of snow in front of the headlights. I let him get 30 feet ahead of me, and I put the truck in drive, and I followed. Deputy Callahan pulled in behind me. Her strobes came on. In my mirrors I could see the red and blue paint the tag alders on the west side of the trail in flashes. I did not look at the tree line again. We went down the two-track slowly. Doyle's plow lifted maybe 18 inches of snow in some spots. In the low places, near the creek crossings, drifts had piled up to 30 inches. He pushed through. His truck is a 2014 Chevy Silverado with a big boss plow, and it is a workhorse. Once, near the halfway point, his rear wheels slipped, and I saw his brake lights flash, and I thought for a bad moment we would be stuck out there, but he caught it and kept going. I stayed 30 feet behind him. I stayed in his tracks. Deputy Callahan stayed 30 feet behind me. Her strobes flashed all the way down. At the gate, Doyle stopped. He got out. He unlocked the padlock with the key I had given him years ago. He swung the gate open. He got back in his truck. He pulled through. I pulled through. Deputy Callahan pulled through. Doyle got out again and closed the gate and locked it. I did not want him to. I wanted to leave the gate open forever. I wanted the gate to rust off the hinges and the two-track to grow back into forest and my grandfather's camp to be swallowed. But he locked it, because that is what you do. We pulled out onto Forest Road 216. It had been plowed sometime that evening. The going was better. Doyle led. I followed. Deputy Callahan followed behind me. She peeled off at the turn onto M28. She keyed her mic and said, "I am with you as far as the highway. State police are on standby if you need anything. Get home." I nodded through the window at her. She nodded back. She turned east, toward Ewan. Doyle and I turned east too, toward Kenton, then farther east toward Sidnaw. I drove behind Doyle's truck. I did not speak to him on the radio. I did not text him on the inReach. I just drove. I watched his taillights. I kept my speed steady. The sun did not come up while I was driving. The storm was still full on, and even after dawn was technically supposed to have arrived, the sky was still a heavy gray murk that could not be called morning. But I remember, at some point past Kenton, seeing the faintest lightning in the east, a slight softening of the gloom, and knowing that we had gotten out of that camp before sunrise. That thought is the one I keep coming back to. We got out before sunrise. I do not know why that matters. I only know that it does. I stayed at Doyle's house in Sidnaw for 2 days. I did not sleep much. I called my wife, who was staying with her sister in Escanaba while I was up hunting, and I told her I was coming home. She heard something in my voice. She asked what happened. I told her I would tell her in person. When I got home, 3 days later, I told her most of it, not all of it. She did not push. She has been married to me long enough to know when I am telling her all of a thing, and when I am telling her most of a thing, and she does not push. I did not go back to the camp until March. My Uncle Ben, my grandfather's younger brother, is the one who went out first, in the middle of March, to check the camp. He drove out with a friend of his who works for the DNR. They said the cabin was fine. The propane tank was low but intact. The wood stove had burned itself out, as Doyle had known it would, and there were no scorch marks or damage. The food I had left was scattered around the interior floor, which they blamed on mice, but which I have my own opinions about. The chili can was punctured in a way I do not think a mouse could do. The paperback book was on the floor, open, spine broken. My uncle did not want to talk about the trail cameras. He said all 4 were still in place. He said the north wall Doe trail cam had been pulled off the tree and was on the ground, screen shattered, housing bent. He said he did not know how that could have happened. He said the wind gets bad in the UP sometimes. He said that with a specific tone, and I did not press him. He brought the SD cards home to me, all 4 of them, he said. You might want to look at these, or you might not. He put them on my kitchen table, and he left. He is a man who understands that some choices belong to the person they belong to. I have looked at 3 of the 4 cards. I have not looked at the Doe Trail card. I do not know if I ever will. The East Food Plot cards were mostly ordinary. Deer, in decreasing numbers as December went on. Almost no activity at all after the 12th. It was as if the plot went silent for weeks. A single fox photograph in late December. A single owl in early January. Then nothing. The West End card was similar. Ordinary photographs through December 9th. Then that photograph of the doe with the leg at the edge of the frame, then almost nothing. Then, on December 15th, 3 photographs in the space of 1 minute at 4:12 a.m. All 3 photographs are of the same shape moving through the frame. It was tall, it was thin, it was pale, it walked upright. Its stride was long, it never looked at the camera, it never slowed. It was moving south, deeper into the woods, away from my camp, away from Forest Road 216. Toward the roadless interior of the Ottawa National Forest. That was the last photograph of anything on that camera. The card ran out of battery on January 6th without capturing another frame. The Doe Trail card I have not looked at. It is in a small Ziploc bag in the top drawer of my dresser. I know from the alerts my phone received before I left the cabin, on the night of the 11th, that there are photographs on it. I know that some of the photographs are of the thing that stood in the trees. I know some of them are the tracks going away. I do not know what else is on it. I do not know if there is a photograph on it of what stood outside the north window of the cabin. I do not know if there is a photograph on it of what stood at the tree line while I sat in my truck. I do not want to know. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Doyle and I have talked about it maybe 4 times since. Doyle is not a talker. He does not want to talk about it, and I do not want to force him to. He said once, sitting on his porch in Sidnaw last April, drinking a beer, "You know what my grandmother would have called it." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "We do not use that word. My family does not use that word." I asked him why. He said, "Because using the word calls it. That is what my grandmother believed. She was born up on the reservation at Lens. She died in 1993. I do not believe in most of what she believed, but I do not use that word." I did not ask again. Deputy Callahan filed a report. I have a copy of it. It says an unidentified subject or subjects appeared to have approached the residence, that footprints were observed around the cabin exterior consistent with a bipedal individual, that no crime was determined to have been committed, and that the occupant vacated the property voluntarily. The report is 2 pages long. It does not describe what she saw at the north window depression. She did not put it in writing. I do not blame her. If I had been her, I would not have put it in writing either. I have not been back to the camp. I do not know if I will sell it. My wife has asked me, gently, whether I want to sell it. I have told her I do not know. My grandfather built that camp with his own hands, and I do not want to be the one who sells it. But I also do not want to be the one who goes back to it. So it sits, out on that 2-track spur off Forest Road 216, with the gate locked and the shutters closed, and the wood stove cold, and it waits. I want to say one more thing before I finish. I have thought many times about what the thing was. I have read things I probably should not have read. I have looked up old stories about the country up there, stories that go back before the loggers, stories the Ojibwe tell that they do not tell to outsiders, stories that the French trappers wrote down in journals in the 18th century, stories that showed up in newspapers in Marquette and Houghton in the 1890s about miners who went out to their cabins and did not come back. Some of the stories name the thing. Doyle will not say the name. I will not write the name here. I do not know if the name matters. I do not know if the name has power the way Doyle's grandmother thought it did, or whether it is just a label people put on a thing they cannot otherwise describe. I know only what I saw and what I heard. I saw a figure on my trail camera at 2:33 a.m. on December 10th that I cannot explain. I saw a leg at the edge of a west stand camera frame that I cannot explain. I saw a doe standing at the edge of my food plot, staring at nothing I could see. I heard a voice that sounded like my best friend calling my name from the tag alders in a whiteout when my best friend was 100 miles away. I heard breathing on the other side of my cabin wall. I heard footsteps circle my cabin twice on two legs. I heard whispering that used my name and the names of dead people in a language I did not know. I saw a shape at the tree line as I sat in my truck. I saw tracks going away from my cabin into the woods that a sheriff's deputy could not explain. I saw photographs, later, of the same shape moving south into the roadless interior of the Ottawa National Forest. I do not know what it was. That is the honest answer. I do not know. It could have been a person. It could have been a hoax. It could have been a man in a costume who wanted to scare a hunter out of his camp and steal his gear, except that no one ever came to the camp after I left. It could have been a bear standing on its hind legs at the edge of infrared range. It could have been many things. But I do not think it was any of those things. I think it was something else. I think whatever it was, it had been watching the camp before I got there. I think it had been watching me since the moment I unlocked the gate on the 9th. I think it was patient. I think it had been patient for a long time. I think it had used its voice on somebody else, once, and remembered what the voice sounded like, and used it on me. I do not know why it did not come through the shutter. I do not know why it did not come down the stovepipe. I do not know why it did not come through the front door, which was only held by an interior slide bolt that a strong shove could have broken. I do not know why it walked 26 steps around the cabin, twice, and then stopped, and then whispered, and then walked away. I think, though this is only what I think, that it was still deciding. I think if I had opened the door when it asked me to open the door, if I had answered the voice when it called my name, if I had made the mistake of stepping outside into the storm to look for Doyle, I would not be telling this story. I think the door was the line. I think the door was, in some way I cannot explain, the line it was not going to cross unless I let it cross. Doyle's grandmother believed a certain kind of thing about invitation, about consent, about whether or not you say the word, or open the door, or step outside. I did not believe her when Doyle told me about her. I believe her now. I believe her now, and I do not go into the woods alone in December, and I do not answer voices that call my name from cover, and I have not opened the Ziploc bag with the SD card in the top drawer of my dresser. Some days I think about opening it. Most days I do not. The camp is still there. The gate is still locked. My Uncle Ben checks on it once a year, in the summer, when the woods are green and warm and full of birdsong. He says it feels like a normal old cabin then. He says it feels like nothing ever happened. He says the tag alders behind the cabin are just tag alders, and the doe trail is just a doe trail, and the West Oak Flat is just a West Oak Flat. He says he does not know why I do not go back. He says maybe I should. Maybe I should. Someday. Some warm afternoon in July, when the sun is high and the mosquitoes are humming and a chickadee is singing in the birches. Someday I might drive up 216 and unlock the gate and drive down that 1.5 miles of two-track and pull up in front of that cabin and open the door and let the summer air into it. Someday I might sit on the porch with a cup of coffee and remember my grandfather and let the woods be woods again. But I will not go in December, and I will not go alone, and I will not go without a rifle and a plow truck and a friend on the other end of a radio who knows to come get me if I miss a check-in. And I will not answer any voice that calls my name from cover, and I will not open the door. Not for anyone. Not for anything. Not ever again.